I've been sitting here for the past hour trying to work out how to explain what I did without making excuses for myself, because there aren't any excuses really. I just made a series of terrible decisions that seemed reasonable at the time because I was broke and desperate. I used to babysit for families in Edinburgh, proper jobs through legitimate agencies where parents interviewed you and checked your references. Then I found a way to get more work without going through all those tedious background checks and interviews, and I told myself it was fine because I was good with children and had nothing to hide. I'm in a hostel in Inverness now, using the last of my money to stay somewhere they don't ask for ID or keep records, because I finally worked out what that babysitting arrangement was really about, who was actually watching those children, while I thought I was the one looking after them. And I'm absolutely terrified of what might happen if they realize I've figured it out. I'd been working as a part-time teaching assistant before the school budget cuts made my position redundant. I was 34, living in a flat share in Leith, and struggling to find anything that paid enough to cover my rent. Childcare seemed like the obvious choice. I'd always been good with children, and the flexibility would let me apply for other jobs while earning enough to get by. The legitimate babysitting agencies required extensive background checks, references from previous employers, even first aid certifications. The whole process took weeks, and the rates they paid weren't brilliant. Maybe £8 or £9 an hour for evening work. I registered with a couple of agencies and got occasional jobs, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover my expenses. That's when I found the listing on a parenting website. Someone was looking for babysitters willing to work flexible hours for families across Edinburgh and the surrounding areas. The rate was significantly better, nearly £20 an hour, and they emphasized that they needed people who could start immediately without the lengthy agency vetting process. The listing explained that the families using their service valued discretion and preferred private arrangements rather than going through traditional agencies. They were busy professionals who needed reliable childcare but didn't want the hassle of interviews and background checks for every new babysitter. I should have questioned why anyone would hire childcare without proper vetting, should have wondered what kind of parents would trust their children with complete strangers. But I was desperate for the money and flattered by the generous hourly rate. I filled out a basic application form online, just my name, contact details, and availability, and received a response within hours. The coordinator explained that they had several families who needed evening and weekend childcare, and they'd match me with appropriate households based on my schedule. My first assignment came the following week. I was given an address in Morningside, instructions to arrive at 6 in the evening, and a brief description of the children I'd be looking after. 2 girls aged 5 and 7. The parents would leave cash payment on the kitchen table and would return by 11. When I arrived at the house, a man answered the door who seemed rushed and distracted. He showed me quickly where everything was. The children were already in their pajamas watching television. Their bedtime was 8 o'clock. Emergency numbers were on the fridge. Then he and his wife left immediately, barely making eye contact with me. The whole interaction felt odd, but I assumed they were just in a hurry. The children were well behaved, and the evening passed without incident. When the parents returned at 11, they thanked me briefly, handed me the cash, and I left. The money was excellent, £100 for 5 hours of easy work. The coordinator contacted me the next day to ask if I'd be available for more assignments, and I agreed immediately. Over the following weeks, I babysat for dozens of different families across Edinburgh. The pattern was always similar. Parents who seemed distracted or uncomfortable, children who were already prepared for bed, brief interactions with minimal conversation. I'd spend a few hours in someone's home, put the children to bed, then wait for the parents to return. What struck me as unusual was that I never babysat for the same family twice. The coordinator explained that their service rotated babysitters to give families variety and flexibility, but it seemed odd that none of these parents wanted consistency for their children. I also noticed that many of the houses had an oddly impersonal quality. They were well furnished and clean, but they lacked the usual clutter and chaos of homes with young children. No artwork on the fridge, no toy overflow in the living room, no family photographs on the walls. When I mentioned this to the coordinator, they explained that many of their clients were new to Edinburgh or had recently moved house, which accounted for the sparse decoration. The explanation seemed plausible enough, though I was starting to feel uncomfortable about the whole arrangement. The breakthrough came when I recognized one of the children from a missing persons appeal I'd seen online several weeks earlier. She was a 6-year-old girl who disappeared from Aberdeen with her mother during a custody dispute. The father had reported them missing, and there'd been a brief media appeal for information about their whereabouts. I was certain it was the same child. Distinctive red hair and a birthmark on her neck that matched the description in the appeal. But she was in a house in Corstorphine with a woman who claimed to be her mother, living under a different name than the one in the missing persons report. I realized I was being used to babysit children who'd been taken by parents during custody battles. The generous rates and lack of proper vetting were because these parents couldn't use legitimate agencies without risking discovery. They needed childcare that wouldn't ask questions or check identities. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that explanation didn't quite fit. The parents I'd met had seemed uncomfortable and distracted, not like people settling into new lives with their children. And the children themselves often seemed subdued and uncertain, not comfortable in their supposedly new homes. I started paying closer attention during my babysitting assignments, looking for signs that would confirm or disprove my theory about custody disputes. What I discovered was far more disturbing than I'd imagined. Many of the houses had security cameras I'd initially assumed were standard home security systems, but they were positioned in unusual locations, focused on the living areas and children's bedrooms, rather than external doors and windows. And the cameras had small lights that suggested they were actively recording. I also noticed that the parents rarely stayed in the house with me when I arrived. They'd leave immediately, as if the whole point was to have me alone with the children, rather than to provide actual childcare support. One evening, while babysitting in a house in Stockbridge, I found a laptop that had been left open in the kitchen. The screen showed what looked like a streaming service, but when I looked closer, I realized it was displaying live footage from the security camera in the living room where I was sitting with the children. Someone was watching us remotely, streaming the footage to viewers elsewhere. And judging by the interface, there were multiple viewers connected to the stream. I felt sick as I understood what I'd been part of. I wasn't babysitting at all. I was providing content for people who wanted to watch children in domestic settings. The parents weren't parents at all, just people who'd been paid to set up these scenarios. And the children, I couldn't bear to think about where those children had really come from, or what happened to them when the babysitting assignments ended. I left the house immediately, abandoning the assignment without explanation. When the coordinator contacted me demanding to know why I'd left early, I made an excuse about a family emergency and said I wouldn't be available for future work. But I couldn't just walk away from what I'd discovered. I had to know if my suspicions were correct, if I'd really been part of something so horrific. Using the same hidden internet channels that I'd noticed advertised on the parenting website where I'd found the original listing, I started investigating. What I found confirmed my worst fears and revealed something even more disturbing than I'd imagined. The babysitting service I'd been working for was part of a larger operation that created domestic scenarios for people to watch remotely. The viewers weren't just watching passively. They were paying substantial amounts for access to these streams, and they could make requests about what they wanted to see. Specific activities, particular types of children, even detailed scenarios they wanted enacted. The babysitters, like me, were unwitting performers in these scenarios, providing a veneer of normalcy and domesticity that made the footage more appealing to viewers. We made it look like real family situations, adding authenticity that pure fabrication couldn't achieve. But it was the discussion threads about the children that made me understand the full horror of what I'd been part of. These weren't children taken in custody disputes or runaways being exploited. They were children who'd been specifically acquired for these scenarios, taken from situations where their disappearance might not be immediately noticed or reported. Foster children who'd been removed from the system, kids from troubled families where parents might not have the resources to mount effective searches, even children from abroad who'd been brought into the country specifically for this purpose. The operation moved them between different houses using different babysitters and creating varied scenarios to provide content variety for their subscribers. Each child might appear in dozens of different streams over weeks or months before being moved elsewhere. I found discussion threads where viewers shared techniques for identifying which children were being used in which scenarios, tracking their appearances across different streams like they were collecting cards. They had favorite babysitters too, discussing which of us created the most authentic domestic atmospheres. I realized I'd been developing a reputation among these viewers as someone who was particularly natural with children, who created the most convincing family scenarios. My name was mentioned repeatedly in their discussions, with viewers requesting more content featuring me specifically. The coordinator had probably been booking me for more assignments because I was popular with subscribers, increasing their revenue by featuring a babysitter that viewers wanted to watch. My genuine care for the children, my comfort in domestic settings, it had all been exploited to create more convincing content for people with the worst possible intentions. I tried to identify which children I'd babysat for might be among those who'd been acquired specifically for this operation. The faces in the streams were sometimes blurred or obscured, but I recognized several from my assignments based on distinctive features or behaviors. The 6-year-old girl from Aberdeen I thought was taken in a custody dispute was among them, which meant the missing persons appeal had probably been fabricated to create a backstory that explained why she disappeared. The operation was sophisticated enough to create false identities and cover stories for the children they were exploiting. I contacted the police immediately, but explaining what I'd discovered without revealing my own involvement proved impossible. I'd been working for this operation for months, providing childcare that enabled their activities, accepting payment for work that facilitated exploitation of children. The officer I spoke to was professional but clearly troubled by my account. They took a statement and said they'd need to involve specialist units that dealt with this type of crime. I was told to expect further contact from investigators and warned that I'd probably be questioned extensively about my role in the operation. But before any further police contact happened, I started receiving threatening messages from the coordinator. They'd realized I'd stopped accepting assignments and had been making inquiries about the operation. The messages made it clear that they knew where I lived and that people who caused problems for their service faced serious consequences. I found evidence that someone had been through my flat while I was out speaking to the police. Nothing had been taken, but personal items had been moved in ways that made it obvious someone had been searching through my belongings. The harassment escalated when I refused to respond to the coordinator's messages. I started receiving packages containing screenshots from the streams I'd appeared in, showing me with various children in different houses. The implication was clear. They had extensive documentation of my involvement with the operation, and they could use it to discredit anything I told the police. I realized I was being blackmailed with my own participation in their activities. Even though I'd been an unwitting participant, the footage showed me in situations that could be interpreted as suspicious or criminal. They could use my involvement to ensure I remained silent about what they were doing. The final threat came in the form of a video message showing the exterior of my flat with a timestamp from that same day. Someone had been watching me, documenting my movements, making it clear they could reach me whenever they chose. That's when I decided I had no choice but to disappear. I withdrew what money I could access, packed essential items, and left Edinburgh immediately. I've been moving between hostels and cheap accommodation since then, trying to avoid creating any digital trail that might help them locate me. But I know running away doesn't protect the children I left behind. They're still being moved between houses, still being watched by paying subscribers, still trapped in an operation that treats them as content to be packaged and sold. I keep thinking about all the children I babysat, wondering where they are now and what's happening to them. The little girl with red hair, who I'd thought was taken in a custody dispute. The quiet boy who'd barely spoken during the evening I'd spent with him. The siblings who'd seemed so uncertain about their surroundings. I was supposed to be looking after them, protecting them, providing safe care while their supposed parents were away. Instead, I was facilitating their exploitation, making the scenarios more convincing for viewers who paid to watch children in vulnerable situations. The worst part is knowing that my genuine care and concern for those children was exactly what made me valuable to the operation. They needed babysitters who would interact naturally with the children, who would create authentic domestic scenarios that satisfied their subscribers' demand for realism. My background in education, my comfort with children, even my financial desperation, they'd all been exploited to make me the perfect unwitting participant in something unspeakably horrible. The operation is probably still active, still recruiting babysitters who are desperate enough to accept work without asking uncomfortable questions, still acquiring children and moving them between properties, still streaming content to subscribers who pay to watch, and I'm hiding in budget hostels, terrified that they'll track me down and ensure I can't tell anyone else what I discovered, terrified that the police investigation won't move quickly enough to save those children, terrified that my involvement, even though I didn't understand what I was really doing, makes me complicit in their suffering. I suppose I'm telling you this because I need someone to know what's happening, what these operations look like from the inside, how they recruit ordinary people by exploiting their financial desperation and their trust that legitimate-seeming opportunities must be safe. If anyone approaches you with childcare work that seems too well paid or doesn't require proper vetting, please question it. Please consider why someone would offer generous rates for work that should require extensive background checks and references. Because the children caught up in these operations can't protect themselves, can't speak up about what's happening to them, can't escape without help from people who recognize the warning signs I ignored for months. And because every day those operations continue, more children are being exploited by people who've industrialized their suffering, turning vulnerability into a commodity that can be packaged and sold to the highest bidder. I just hope the police can shut down the operation before more children are harmed, before more desperate babysitters are recruited to create content they don't understand they're producing. before the people behind this move their activities elsewhere and start the whole process again with new victims. But I'm not optimistic, because the people running these operations understand how to exploit technology, how to manipulate desperate workers, and how to ensure that everyone involved becomes complicit enough that speaking up means incriminating yourself. All I can do now is hide and hope that eventually my conscience will let me sleep at night again, though I doubt that day will ever come. I'm still not sure I should be telling anyone this, and I keep going back and forth about whether I imagined the whole thing, or if it was as bad as I think it was. It started with an email that clearly wasn't meant for me. I work in accounts for a small manufacturing company in Preston. Nothing exciting, just processing invoices and keeping track of payments. Most of my day involves opening emails from suppliers and customers, so when I got a message with no clear sender information, I assumed it was another routine business inquiry. The email contained what appeared to be a shopping list, but not for anything you'd buy at a normal shop. I didn't recognize the clinical names of the items, the quantities seemed unusually precise, and the delivery instructions were significantly more detailed than what one would anticipate for everyday purchases. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam or had been sent to the wrong address by mistake. But something about the precision of the list made me curious about what these items actually were and why someone needed them in such specific quantities. When I searched for some of the item names online, I found they were specialized medical supplies and pharmaceutical compounds that weren't available through normal retail channels. The sort of things that would typically require professional licensing or medical supervision to obtain legally. But the email wasn't from any medical facility or legitimate healthcare provider. The sender information was minimal, and the delivery instructions seemed designed to maintain anonymity rather than ensure proper handling of what appeared to be controlled substances. I started to suspect that I'd accidentally received someone's order for illegal drugs or medical supplies, possibly intended for activities that couldn't be conducted through legitimate channels. The responsible thing would have been to delete the email and forget about it. But I found myself researching the items more thoroughly, trying to understand what they were used for and why someone would need them outside of proper medical supervision. What I discovered made me deeply uncomfortable. Several of the compounds could be used to incapacitate people without their knowledge, while others were designed for medical procedures that would be extremely dangerous if performed by unqualified individuals. The shopping list wasn't for legitimate medical supplies. It was an order for materials that could be used to drug, restrain, or perform unauthorized medical procedures on unwilling victims. But understanding what the email contained didn't provide clear guidance about what I should do with the information. I had no way of knowing who had sent it, who was supposed to receive it, or whether anyone was in immediate danger from these materials being obtained and used. I tried to trace the email back to its source, hoping to understand more about who might be ordering these dangerous supplies and what they planned to do with them. That research led me to websites I'd never seen before, platforms that required specific access methods and seemed to exist outside normal internet browsing, places where people could order various types of restricted materials and services that weren't available through legitimate channels. The platforms contained extensive catalogs of medical supplies, pharmaceutical compounds, and equipment that could be obtained without the usual verification and oversight that legitimate suppliers would require. But mixed in with items that might have legitimate uses were products that were clearly intended for harmful purposes. Substances for incapacitating people, equipment for restraining victims, even instructional materials for performing procedures that no qualified medical professional would attempt outside proper facilities. The email I'd received wasn't an isolated transaction, but part of systematic commerce in materials that could be used to harm people in ways that would be difficult for law enforcement to detect or prosecute. The casual way these items were advertised and sold suggested that systematic harm against unwilling victims was routine business for people who understood how to access these hidden marketplaces. But the most disturbing discovery was that the platforms weren't just selling physical items. They also facilitated services where people could arrange for others to be targeted using the same dangerous materials and techniques. Clients could commission systematic drugging, restraint, or medical procedures against specific individuals. With service providers who specialized in using the ordered materials against victims who would never know they were being systematically harmed. I realized that the email I'd received might have been connected to ongoing crimes against real people, with the medical supplies being used to facilitate activities that range from systematic poisoning to unauthorized medical procedures. But proving this connection would require much more investigation than I could safely undertake, especially since the people involved had clearly developed sophisticated methods for maintaining anonymity and avoiding law enforcement detection. Meanwhile, similar orders were probably being processed regularly, with dangerous materials being distributed to people who planned to use them against unwilling victims in ways that would be extremely difficult to trace or prevent. The wrong email that had seemed like a simple delivery mistake had instead provided insight into systematic criminal commerce that facilitated ongoing harm against people who had no idea they were being targeted. But reporting what I'd discovered would require explaining how I'd learned about these illegal marketplaces, potentially making me appear complicit in criminal activities, while failing to provide specific information about individual victims or perpetrators. The email order had probably been rerouted to a different address by this point, with the dangerous materials being delivered to their intended recipient who could use them for whatever harmful purposes they'd originally planned. I never received any follow-up emails or communications related to the original message, suggesting that the sender had realized their mistake and taken steps to ensure their future orders wouldn't be misdirected to innocent recipients. But I remained disturbed by the knowledge that these marketplaces existed and were probably continuing to facilitate systematic harm against victims who would never understand what was being done to them or why they were experiencing unexplained health problems or behavioral changes. Every time I felt unwell or experienced symptoms I couldn't explain, I found myself wondering whether someone might have access to the same materials I'd seen advertised through those hidden platforms, and whether my own food, drinks, or environment might have been compromised by people who understood how to obtain and use dangerous substances without detection. The business email system that was supposed to help me process routine invoices and correspondence had instead made me aware of criminal commerce that operated parallel to legitimate business, using similar communication methods to coordinate activities that caused systematic harm to people who never knew they were being targeted. When I eventually changed jobs and moved to a different company, I made sure to use completely new email addresses and avoided any online activities that might lead me back to the platforms I discovered through that accidental message. But the knowledge that such systematic criminal commerce existed made every interaction with strangers feel potentially dangerous, knowing that people who appeared completely normal might have access to materials and services that could be used to cause harm in ways that would be nearly impossible to detect or prove. I started volunteering to help elderly people with their computer problems, but it turns out someone was using my visits to case their homes for burglaries. My grandmother had always been hopeless with technology, and watching her struggle with basic things like email and online banking made me realize how isolated older people can become when the world goes digital. After she died during my second year at university, I decided to volunteer with a local charity that helped elderly residents learn to use computers and stay connected with family online. The charity was called Digital Bridges and operated throughout South Wales, providing free computer training and technical support to pensioners who couldn't afford commercial services or felt intimidated by technology. Most of their work involved visiting people in their homes to set up equipment, teach basic skills, and troubleshoot problems with internet connections or software. I'd always been reasonably good with computers, not an expert, but capable of handling the sort of problems that seem insurmountable to people who didn't grow up with technology. Basic virus removal, setting up email accounts, helping people navigate online shopping or government websites. The kind of support that takes 5 minutes if you know what you're doing, but can be completely mystifying if you don't. The training process with Digital Bridges was straightforward. They provided background checks for all volunteers, basic training on computer security and data protection, and guidelines for working safely in people's homes. The charity had been operating for several years and had built up a good reputation with social services and local councils. My coordinator was a woman called Sarah who managed volunteers across the Cardiff area. She seemed professional and knowledgeable, with extensive experience in community outreach and elderly care. She explained that most of their clients were referred through social services, doctors' surgeries, or local community centres when people needed help staying connected with family or accessing essential online services. The work itself was rewarding in exactly the way I'd hoped. Most clients were genuinely grateful for help with technology that allowed them to video chat with grandchildren, order groceries online, or manage their finances without having to travel to bank branches. Simple assistance that made a significant difference to people's independence and quality of life. But after a few weeks of regular visits, I started noticing aspects of the Digital Bridges operation that seemed unusual for a charity focused on computer training. Sarah was surprisingly interested in details about clients' living situations that didn't seem relevant to providing technical support. She wanted to know about security arrangements, valuable items people owned, and whether they had family members who visited regularly. When I asked why this information was necessary, she explained that understanding clients' circumstances helped the charity provide appropriate support and identify people who might need additional services. The client referral process also seemed more complex than necessary for a simple computer training program. Rather than just providing contact details and basic information about what help people needed, referrals included comprehensive background information about clients' financial situations, health conditions, and family relationships. Sarah explained that this detailed information helped volunteers provide personalized support and identify potential safety concerns when visiting vulnerable people in their homes. But the level of detail seemed excessive for what should have been straightforward technical assistance. I began paying more attention to the other volunteers working for Digital Bridges, trying to understand whether they shared my concerns about the organization's practices. Most volunteers were genuinely committed to helping elderly people with technology problems and seemed unaware of any issues with how the charity operated. But I noticed that Sarah assigned certain volunteers to specific types of clients in ways that didn't seem to be based purely on technical expertise or geographic convenience. Volunteers with particular backgrounds or skills were consistently assigned to clients who lived alone, had valuable possessions, or received minimal family support. Meanwhile, clients who lived with relatives or had active social networks were usually assigned to different volunteers who seemed less experienced or committed to the work. The pattern suggested that Sarah was systematically matching certain volunteers with vulnerable clients who might be suitable targets for some purpose beyond computer training. When I tried to discuss this with other volunteers, most seemed genuinely confused by my concerns and suggested that I was reading too much into normal administrative decisions about workload distribution and volunteer capabilities. But a few volunteers admitted they'd noticed similar patterns and had wondered about the charity's selection criteria for client assignments. Some had been asked to gather specific information about clients' daily routines, security arrangements, and valuable possessions in ways that seemed unrelated to providing technical support. One volunteer mentioned that Sarah had specifically requested detailed reports about clients' homes, including information about door and window security, alarm systems, and the location of expensive items like jewelry or electronics. When the volunteer had questioned why this information was necessary, Sarah had explained that it helped the charity assess whether clients needed additional support services or referrals to other organizations. I started documenting the information requests I received from Sarah, looking for patterns that might reveal what she was really interested in learning about our clients. The requests consistently focused on details that would be valuable for planning burglaries or other crimes against vulnerable elderly people. She wanted to know when clients were typically alone, what security measures they had in place, and what valuable items they owned that might be worth stealing. Most concerning was her interest in clients' relationships with family members and neighbors. She wanted to know who had keys to their homes when relatives visited, and whether anyone would notice if clients were absent or in distress for extended periods. This information would be crucial for criminals planning to target elderly people who were isolated and vulnerable to theft, fraud, or worse. I realized that Digital Bridges might not be a legitimate charity at all. Instead, it appeared to be a criminal operation that used computer training as a pretext for gathering intelligence about potential victims of crime. The volunteers were unknowingly conducting reconnaissance for people who planned to exploit or harm the elderly clients we thought we were helping. When I tried to research Digital Bridges more thoroughly, I found that while the charity was officially registered and had proper documentation, there was very little information about its leadership, funding sources, or actual activities beyond the basic computer training services. The charity's website and promotional materials looked professional, but they contained minimal specific information about their programs, success stories, or partnerships with other organizations. For an established charity that claimed to serve hundreds of clients across South Wales, their public profile was surprisingly limited. Most legitimate charities had extensive documentation about their work, regular reports to funders, and active engagement with local media and community organizations. Digital Bridges seemed to operate with much less transparency and accountability than would be expected for an organization providing services to vulnerable populations. I tried contacting some of the organizations that supposedly referred clients to Digital Bridges, hoping to verify that they were aware of the charity's activities and had confidence in their services. What I found was concerning. Several social services departments and community centers claimed to have no record of referring clients to Digital Bridges, despite Sarah's claims that they were regular sources of referrals. Others had minimal information about the charity and couldn't verify that they had ongoing relationships with the organization. The pattern suggested that Digital Bridges was operating with much less oversight and legitimacy than they'd claimed during my volunteer training. I decided to investigate some of the clients I'd been assigned to help, hoping to understand more about how they'd been connected with the charity and whether they'd experienced any problems beyond their original computer issues. This investigation was more difficult because contacting clients directly could alert Sarah that I was questioning the charity's operations, but I was able to research some of them through public records and local news reports. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Several clients I'd worked with had subsequently experienced burglaries, fraud attempts, or other crimes that seemed to be based on detailed knowledge of their living situations and daily routines. In most cases, the crimes had occurred weeks or months after my visits, with enough time delay that the connection to digital bridges wouldn't be immediately obvious. But the specific nature of what had been stolen or attempted suggested that the perpetrators had detailed inside information about the victims' homes and circumstances. One elderly woman I'd helped set up email had been burglarized 3 weeks after my visit. The thieves had known exactly where she kept her jewelry, had avoided rooms where valuable items weren't stored, and had timed their break-in for a period when she was predictably absent for medical appointments. Another client had been targeted by telephone fraudsters who had detailed knowledge of his financial situation and family relationships that could only have been obtained through systematic surveillance or inside information. The pattern was consistent across multiple clients, suggesting that information gathered during Digital Bridge's visits was being used to facilitate crimes against the elderly people we were supposed to be helping. I was unknowingly participating in a criminal operation that targeted vulnerable elderly people for exploitation and theft. But confronting Sarah directly about what I discovered would alert her that the operation had been compromised and might result in evidence being destroyed or the entire scheme being relocated before victims could be protected. I needed to find a way to document the criminal activity and alert law enforcement without revealing that I'd discovered the truth about digital bridges. I started keeping detailed records of all my interactions with Sarah and the specific information requests she made about clients. I also began photographing any documents or materials related to the charity's operations that I could access during volunteer meetings or training sessions. Most importantly, I tried to identify other clients who might be at risk of being targeted for crimes based on the types of information Sarah had requested about their circumstances. This process revealed that the Digital Bridges operation was much larger than I'd initially realized. Sarah was coordinating multiple volunteers across several local authorities, systematically gathering intelligence about elderly people throughout South Wales. The scale of the operation suggested that it wasn't just opportunistic crime, but a systematic business that specialized in identifying and exploiting vulnerable elderly people through fake charity work. But while I was building evidence of the criminal operation, I also became aware that Sarah was monitoring the volunteers much more closely than I'd initially realized. She began asking specific questions about my interactions with clients that suggested she was tracking exactly what information I'd gathered and how thoroughly I documented their circumstances. When I provided less detailed reports than she expected, she expressed concern that I wasn't taking the charity's assessment responsibilities seriously enough. Sarah also started assigning me to new clients in different areas, claiming that my skills were needed for more complex technical problems. But the new assignments were all people who lived alone, had minimal family support, and owned valuable possessions that would make attractive targets for criminals. I realized that Sarah was testing my willingness to gather the detailed intelligence information that the criminal operation required, and that my reduced cooperation had been noticed. If I continued to resist providing the information she wanted, I might be dropped from the volunteer program before I could gather enough evidence to expose the operation. But if I cooperated with her requests, I'd be directly facilitating crimes against innocent elderly people. Meanwhile, the clients I'd already worked with remained at risk of being targeted for crimes based on information I'd unknowingly provided during my early visits. I decided that I had to prioritize protecting potential victims, even if it meant revealing that I'd discovered the criminal nature of the Digital Bridges operation. I started contacting some of the clients I'd worked with, claiming to be conducting follow-up surveys about the charity's services. During these conversations, I tried to warn them about potential security risks without directly accusing Digital Bridges of criminal activity. I suggested that they review their home security arrangements, be cautious about sharing personal information with strangers, and consider changing their daily routines if they felt unsafe or observed. Most clients were receptive to these suggestions and appreciated the follow-up contact from someone they'd worked with previously. But some seemed confused about why I was providing security advice that went well beyond computer training. I also started researching how to report the criminal operation to law enforcement in a way that would protect both the potential victims and my own legal situation. Reporting suspected criminal activity was complicated by my own involvement in gathering some of the intelligence that could be used to harm elderly clients. Even though I'd been unknowingly participating in the scheme, I could potentially be charged as an accessory if prosecutors decided that I should have recognized the criminal nature of the operation sooner. But I also knew that delaying action to protect my own interests would mean that more elderly people would be victimized by criminals who were using my volunteer work to facilitate their crimes. The morning I decided to contact the police, Sarah called to inform me that the charity was expanding its operations and needed volunteers who were willing to take on additional responsibilities. She explained that Digital Bridges had secured funding for a new program that would provide more comprehensive support to elderly clients, including assistance with financial management, home security assessments, and family communication services. The new program would require volunteers to gather much more detailed information about clients' circumstances and to provide regular reports about their welfare and security needs. Sarah offered me a paid position coordinating the expanded program in the Cardiff area, with responsibility for training new volunteers and managing client assessments. It was clear that the criminal operation was expanding and that Sarah wanted to recruit me as a more active participant in systematically targeting elderly people for exploitation. I had run out of time to gather more evidence or find a way to expose the operation without compromising my own safety. I thought buying a refurbished laptop from a small computer shop would save me some money, but it turns out the previous owner had left more than just their old files on the hard drive. My ancient Dell had finally died after years of loyal service, and replacing it wasn't exactly in the budget. I'd been made redundant from my admin job 6 months earlier and was still looking for steady work, so spending hundreds on a new computer wasn't an option. The little repair shop on Hertford Street had a selection of refurbished machines at reasonable prices, older models that had been cleaned up and given new leases of life. The owner assured me that all personal data would be wiped from whatever I chose, though he mentioned that occasionally people found random files that the formatting process had missed. I picked a 3-year-old Lenovo that seemed perfect for my needs: word processing, job applications, basic internet browsing. Nothing fancy, but functional enough to help with my job search and personal correspondence. The laptop worked well for the first few weeks. It was noticeably faster than my old machine, and I was pleased with what seemed like a good purchase that would serve me well while I rebuilt my finances. But when I was organizing files one evening, I discovered a folder buried deep in the system directories that hadn't been deleted during the refurbishment process. It was labeled with a series of numbers and letters that didn't mean anything to me, but curiosity got the better of my common sense. Inside the folder were hundreds of documents, images, and what appeared to be correspondence files. Most seemed innocuous enough. Personal letters, family photographs, financial records that belonged to someone I didn't know. But mixed in with the normal personal documents were files that made me deeply uncomfortable. Detailed profiles of various people, complete with photographs, personal information, daily routines, and what appeared to be surveillance notes documenting their activities over extended periods. The profiles weren't just casual observations. They included comprehensive intelligence about each person's vulnerabilities, relationships, financial circumstances, and behavioral patterns that could only have been gathered through systematic stalking or professional investigation. Some profiles contained information about security arrangements at people's homes and workplaces, including details about alarm systems, daily schedules, and times when properties would be unoccupied. But most disturbing were documents that appeared to be contracts or agreements related to these profiles. Financial arrangements for what were described as comprehensive disappearance services, with pricing structures based on the complexity of individual cases. I was looking at evidence of what appeared to be a systematic operation that provided services for making people vanish permanently, complete with detailed intelligence gathering and pricing for different levels of service. The previous owner of my laptop had apparently been involved in facilitating disappearances, with the accumulated files representing months or years of preparation for eliminating specific individuals who had been targeted by clients willing to pay substantial sums for these services. But understanding what I'd discovered didn't provide clear guidance about what to do with the information. I was holding evidence of potential murders or kidnappings, but the files were vague enough that proving specific crimes would be difficult without additional investigation. I tried to research some of the names mentioned in the profiles, hoping to understand whether these were real people who might be missing or in danger. What I found was disturbing. Several names corresponded to people who had been reported missing in various parts of the UK over the past 2 years, with circumstances that matched the detailed intelligence contained in the laptop files. The disappearances had been treated as voluntary departures by police, since the missing persons were adults with no obvious enemies or reasons to be targeted for violence. But the systematic intelligence gathering suggested these weren't random disappearances or people choosing to start new lives elsewhere. Someone had been systematically targeting specific individuals, gathering comprehensive intelligence about their circumstances, and then facilitating their permanent removal in ways that avoided arousing suspicion from law enforcement. The laptop files represented a professional service that specialized in making people disappear while ensuring their absence appeared voluntary or accidental rather than criminal. But the most troubling discovery was that the files included active cases, people who were apparently being assessed and prepared for disappearance services that hadn't been completed yet. Recent surveillance reports, updated intelligence, and what appeared to be final preparations for eliminating individuals who might still be unaware they'd been targeted. I was holding current evidence of planned crimes against people who could potentially be saved if I could identify them and alert appropriate authorities. But extracting actionable intelligence from the files required accessing specific platforms and communication methods that were referenced in the documents, but weren't immediately accessible through normal internet browsing. The disappearance service operated through hidden websites that required specialized access methods, with clients and service providers communicating through platforms designed to maintain anonymity and avoid law enforcement detection. When I eventually found ways to access these hidden platforms, I discovered an entire marketplace dedicated to various forms of elimination services, with the disappearance operation being just one option among many available to people who wanted specific individuals removed from their lives permanently. The casual way these services were advertised and discussed suggested that facilitating disappearances was a routine business transaction, with professional service providers competing for clients who needed people eliminated for personal, financial, or business reasons. The laptop files weren't evidence of isolated criminal activity, but documentation of systematic services that were available to anyone willing to pay for professional elimination of problem individuals. But proving the connection between the marketplace and actual disappearances would require much more investigation than I could safely undertake on my own, especially since the people involved had demonstrated sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. Meanwhile, the active cases mentioned in the laptop files were probably proceeding toward completion, with targeted individuals continuing their normal lives unaware that they'd been systematically assessed and marked for elimination. The refurbished laptop that was supposed to help me find new employment had instead provided me with evidence of organized elimination services that were operating while maintaining complete anonymity and avoiding law enforcement detection. But reporting what I discovered would require explaining how I'd found the information, potentially making me a person of interest in criminal investigations, while failing to prevent ongoing crimes against people whose elimination had already been contracted and paid for. I eventually contacted police through an anonymous tip line, providing general information about the disappearance service without revealing how I'd learned about their activities or identifying specific individuals who might be targeted. But I remained concerned about the active cases that were probably still proceeding, and about the possibility that the people operating these elimination services might attempt to recover the laptop files I discovered. The computer shop where I'd purchased the refurbished machine claimed to have no information about the previous owner, and the files themselves contained no identifying details that could be traced back to specific individuals or organizations. The elimination service was probably continuing to operate while recruiting new clients and targeting additional people for disappearance, using methods that had been refined through years of successful operations that had avoided law enforcement detection. When I finally replaced the refurbished laptop with a different machine, I destroyed the hard drive completely, but I never stopped wondering whether the people in those active case files had managed to avoid the elimination services that had been contracted against them, or whether they'd simply joined the growing list of individuals who had disappeared without explanation or accountability. Imagine if the biggest mistake in your life came from being curious about something you saw in a film. That's what happened to my nephew, Tom, and it's why I can't sleep properly anymore. He was 16, the kind of kid who spent his weekends helping his gran with her garden and riding his bike down to the harbour to watch the fishing boats come in. Not the sort you'd expect to get mixed up in something dark. But that's the thing about curiosity. It doesn't discriminate. It started last autumn when he watched some thriller at the cinema in Truro about people being kidnapped and forced to perform for online audiences. The film made it seem like these things actually happened, that there were websites hidden beneath the normal internet where people paid to watch terrible things in real time. Most adults would have dismissed it as Hollywood nonsense. But 16-year-olds don't have that filter yet. Tom lived with his mum in Polperro, one of those picture postcard Cornish villages where everyone knows everyone, and the most exciting thing that usually happens is a tourist getting stuck in the narrow streets with a rental car. His dad had left when he was small, so it was just the two of them in a cottage overlooking the harbour. She worked at the local primary school and trusted him to be sensible while she was out. The trouble began when he started researching whether the film's premise was real. he found a Reddit thread discussing the movie, where users debated its authenticity. Most dismissed it as fiction, but a few claimed to know otherwise. One user posted a cryptic comment: "The rabbit hole goes deeper than Hollywood thinks. PM me if you're actually curious." Tom's curiosity got the better of him. He messaged the user, who responded with a YouTube link disguised as a tutorial for advanced internet privacy. The video seemed innocent enough. A bearded man in a basement explaining VPNs and encryption. But buried in the comments section were breadcrumbs, references to Tor, specific forum names, and invitation codes. It took him several weeks to work out how to access these hidden networks. The learning curve was steep, but he persisted, documenting his progress in a private Discord server he'd created. Looking back, that was his first mistake, creating a digital trail of his journey into the shadows. When he finally managed to connect, he spent hours exploring, fascinated by this parallel internet. Most of what he found was disappointing. Defunct forums, conspiracy sites, and pages that looked like they'd been abandoned for years. But he kept searching, following links and recommendations, going deeper into increasingly obscure corners. The breakthrough came when he found a forum dedicated to discussing the very type of content he'd seen in the film. Users shared links and recommendations with clinical detachment, discussing authenticity like film critics. Reading through the posts, he realized that what he thought was pure fiction might actually exist. The sites themselves were surprisingly primitive. Basic interfaces that looked like they'd been cobbled together by amateurs. Most required payments through complicated systems, but several offered preview sections that were freely available. The previews were disturbing enough. Grainy footage of people in windowless rooms, movements too natural to be acted, reactions too genuine to be scripted. What bothered him most was how organized it seemed, despite the amateur appearance. This wasn't random content uploaded by individuals. Someone was running a proper operation with regular schedules and systematic approach. The forums contained discussions about production quality, request systems, and expansion plans. From what he could gather, the operation was smaller than the film had suggested, but more real. It seemed to be an emerging network, testing methods and building capabilities, rather than some vast established enterprise. The amateurish appearance was deliberate, designed to look like a few perverts with cameras rather than something more coordinated. The discussions revealed they were actively recruiting both participants and what they called local assets, people who could provide information about potential targets in their areas. They weren't just looking for victims. They needed intelligence gatherers, people who understood local dynamics and could spot opportunities. Tom's mistake was engaging with the forum using the same username he'd used elsewhere online. His digital footprint was surprisingly extensive. Gaming forums, social media, even school project submissions. Anyone looking could piece together his real identity, location, and interests within hours. The first sign they'd noticed him came through his Discord server. Files appeared that he hadn't uploaded. Screenshots of his own posts, maps of Polperro with his cottage marked, even photos of him taken from his school's website. Someone had been systematically cataloging his online presence. His laptop's webcam began activating randomly, the little light blinking on during the night. When he covered it, files on his desktop would be subtly altered, documents renamed, folders reorganized, photos edited with barely visible changes. They were demonstrating access to his digital life, showing him how completely they could invade his privacy. The psychological pressure was subtle but effective. His browsing history would be altered to include sites he'd never visited. His social media accounts would show login attempts from locations across the country, and his email would receive messages that seemed to know details about his daily routine. Sleep became almost impossible. He'd lie awake wondering if the webcam was recording, if his microphone was listening, if his every keystroke was being monitored. The laptop that had been his window to the world became a source of constant anxiety. The surveillance escalated when someone began asking questions about him in the village. His mum mentioned that a stranger had approached her at the school, claiming to be conducting research on rural internet infrastructure. The questions had been specifically about teenage online habits and computer literacy in the area. They'd identified him as potentially useful, a tech-savvy local teenager with detailed knowledge of the community, living in an area with limited police presence and isolated enough for discreet operations. But more than that, they needed a test subject for their Cornwall expansion, and Tom had unknowingly volunteered by documenting his journey into their world. The breakthrough came when he found evidence of their local operations. Forum posts discussed reconnaissance trips to Cornwall, photos of abandoned buildings within driving distance of Polperro, and conversations about the advantages of working in rural areas. They weren't just theoretically interested in his region. They were actively preparing to operate there. More disturbing was discovering that several local teenagers were already being discussed as potential targets. He recognized names from his school, descriptions of people he knew, references to family situations and social media activity. The users weren't just planning, they were already gathering intelligence. The realization that he might have accidentally identified himself as both an asset and a target hit him hard. His online activities had demonstrated his capabilities, whilst his location made him valuable for local intelligence. By exploring their world, he'd made himself visible to people who specialized in exploiting curiosity. The direct contact began with a message on his Discord server. "We know you've been watching. Time to be useful." Attached was a single photo, his bedroom window, taken from outside the cottage. The message was clear. They could reach him whenever they wanted. Instead of dramatic confrontations, they offered a simple arrangement: help with basic intelligence gathering, monitoring social media, noting when people traveled, identifying vulnerable individuals, and his online activities would remain private. Refuse and his browsing history would be shared with his mum, his school, the local police. The work started small. Screenshot certain social media posts, note when families mentioned holiday plans, track the online activity of specific teenagers. Nothing that seemed directly harmful, but each task connected him deeper into their operations. Tom tried to resist, but the leverage was too strong. They'd compiled a comprehensive dossier of his dark web exploration, complete with timestamps, screenshots, and a detailed analysis of his interests. His curiosity had been weaponized against him. The psychological control was masterful. They never threatened violence, never demanded anything obviously criminal. Instead, they gradually normalized his cooperation, making each new request seem like a natural progression from the last. His moral boundaries eroded through small compromises that individually seemed manageable. One autumn evening, the power went out across the peninsula during a storm. Not the dramatic blackout of horror films, but the kind of routine outage that rural areas experience regularly. Tom's mum went to stay with a friend whose house had a generator, leaving him alone in the cottage. 2 days later, a small package arrived with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a single slip of paper with login credentials. The drive contained access to a private forum where his username was already recognized. His handlers had decided his period of basic intelligence gathering was over. It was time for more direct involvement. The USB drive contained detailed profiles of local teenagers, complete with photos, social media analysis, and vulnerability assessments. His job was to verify the information, add local context, and identify the most promising targets. His transformation from observer to participant was complete. He spent the next several hours reading through files that contained painfully detailed information about people he'd known all his life. The profiles weren't just demographic data. They included psychological assessments, family dynamics, and exploitation strategies. Someone had invested serious effort in understanding his community. By dawn, he understood his true role in their operation. He wasn't just providing intelligence, he was helping them select victims from his own community. His local knowledge, gained through a lifetime of village life, was being used to identify which of his neighbors were most vulnerable to manipulation. The trap had been perfectly constructed. His eagerness to understand had provided the initial contact. His digital footprint had given them leverage, and his local knowledge made him indispensable. Every choice he'd made since watching that film had led him deeper into their web. The network's activities in Cornwall expanded gradually over the following months. Tom's intelligence proved accurate and valuable, enabling them to operate with confidence in an area they'd never worked before. Every few weeks, they'd remind him they still had the files, just in case he forgot. His cooperation had made their expansion possible. The guilt was overwhelming. Missing person reports, worried parents, teenagers who disappeared for days before returning changed, all traced back to information he'd provided. His questions had been transformed into complicity, his knowledge into a weapon against his own community. The authorities remained unaware of the network's activities. They investigated individual incidents without recognizing the pattern, pursued obvious suspects without understanding the sophisticated recruitment and control methods being employed. Their traditional approaches were inadequate for addressing a threat this well organized. Tom's academic performance collapsed as the psychological pressure mounted. He started keeping lists of everything he said to everyone, terrified he might forget who knew what. Teachers noticed his declining grades and withdrawal from social activities, but attributed them to typical teenage stress. The real source of his problems couldn't be discussed with anyone. The network continued to grow, not through dramatic expansion, but through careful cultivation of assets like Tom. They were building a distributed operation, using local knowledge and digital leverage to establish footholds in communities across the country. What had started as curiosity about a film had become participation in something far more sinister. The most disturbing realization was that Tom's story wasn't unique. The network's recruitment methods were systematic and repeatable, designed to convert questions into complicity. They were building a network of reluctant accomplices, each trapped by their own digital footprints and moral compromises. As I write this, Tom is still in Polperro, still providing intelligence, still carrying secrets that age him beyond his years. The boy who just wanted answers about a film has been replaced by someone who understands too much about the darkness that exists beneath the surface of normal life. The network continues to operate and expand, feeding on the natural inquisitiveness of young people who stumble across references to its activities. Each new recruit follows a similar path: initial questions, gradual involvement, eventual complicity. The cycle perpetuates itself, growing stronger with each iteration. But what haunts me most isn't Tom's story, or even the network's continued operation. It's the realization that right now, someone reading this might be wondering if such things could really exist. Someone might be inquisitive enough to start looking, to start searching, to take the first steps down a path that leads to the same destination. Do you remember when you were younger and life was simpler? When the worst thing that could happen during a sleepover was your mate's mum finding the magazines you'd hidden under the mattress, or getting caught sneaking downstairs to watch something you weren't supposed to see on late-night television. Those innocent transgressions feel almost quaint now, knowing what I know about what some people actually watch when the lights go out. I was 23 when it happened, working as a trainee accountant in Birmingham and living in a shared house with 3 other guys. There was nothing glamorous about any of it. We split the bills 4 ways, took turns buying toilet roll, and spent most evenings playing games or arguing about whose turn it was to clean the kitchen. The sort of mundane existence that millions of people live without anything particularly interesting ever happening to them. My housemate Jake had always been the tech-savvy one among us. Not in a professional way, just the kind of person who knew how to fix your laptop when it started running slowly, or how to stream films that weren't available on Netflix yet. He'd spent hours on forums discussing privacy software and online security, the sort of conversations that made the rest of us glaze over and reach for our phones. The change in his behavior started gradually. He'd always been a bit antisocial, preferring his computer to actual human interaction. But this was different. He stopped joining us for meals, barely acknowledged us when we passed in the hallway, and we'd hear him moving around his room at strange hours. 2 in the morning, 4, sometimes just before dawn. Something about the way he looked at us changed too. Like he was seeing us differently, evaluating us in a way that made casual conversation feel uncomfortable. The sounds were what first made me properly notice something was off. Not just the usual keyboard clicking and mouse movements you'd expect from someone browsing the internet, but irregular patterns, long periods of complete silence, then sudden bursts of activity. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like muffled conversations, though we never saw anyone visiting his room. I mentioned it to the others, but they weren't particularly concerned. University houses are always full of odd noises and strange schedules. Still, we found ourselves unconsciously avoiding his part of the house, taking longer routes to the kitchen or bathroom to avoid walking past his door. None of us talked about it explicitly, but there was a shared sense that something felt off about being near his space. The first real warning sign came when I bumped into him in the kitchen one morning around 6. He looked terrible, pale, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept properly in days. When I asked if he was all right, he just stared at me for several seconds before mumbling something about work stress and disappearing back upstairs. Work stress seemed unlikely, given that he worked part-time at a local computer repair shop and had never shown any particular ambition or pressure about his career. But people deal with things differently, and it wasn't really my place to pry into his personal problems. We weren't close friends, just housemates sharing expenses and common areas. The electricity bills started arriving higher than usual around the same time. Not dramatically higher, but enough for us to notice when we were splitting costs 4 ways. When we asked about it, he claimed his computer had been running more intensive software for some freelance projects. Again, nothing that seemed worth arguing about, though it did add to the general sense that something had changed. His room began to smell different as well. Not unpleasant exactly, but stale and closed off, like air that hadn't been properly circulated for weeks. The few times his door was open when I passed, I caught glimpses of thick sheets hung over the windows and the glow of screens arranged at odd angles, creating shadows that seemed deliberately designed to obscure what was actually happening in there. There were cables everywhere, trailing across the floor in patterns that suggested something more complex than a simple computer setup. We started hearing voices from his room more regularly, always muffled, always unclear, but definitely not just him. Sometimes it sounded like multiple people talking at once. Other times, like single voices giving instructions or making requests. The conversations never seemed to follow normal patterns. No back and forth exchanges, no laughter, just these odd, disjointed fragments of speech. The internet connection throughout the house became increasingly unreliable. Pages would load slowly, streaming services would buffer constantly, and online games would lag to the point of being unplayable. When we complained to our internet provider, they insisted nothing was wrong with the connection, but the problems persisted. It felt like someone was using enormous amounts of bandwidth for something. I started paying more attention to his routine, not out of any particular suspicion, but because his behavior was affecting the rest of us. He'd leave his room only during specific hours, usually when the rest of us were out or asleep. The timing seemed deliberate, like he was actively avoiding contact with anyone else in the house. The packages started arriving more frequently as well, small, unmarked deliveries that he'd collect immediately and take straight to his room. When I asked the postman about them one day, he mentioned that our address was receiving more packages than most houses on the street, but couldn't tell me anything specific about the contents or senders. One evening, while he was out at his regular job, I heard sounds coming from his room. Not possible, obviously, since he wasn't home, but definitely something electronic, beeping, clicking, the sort of noises computers make when they're processing information or receiving data. The sounds continued for several hours, stopping only when I heard his key in the front door. The breaking point came during a particularly hot week in July. The house felt stifling, and we'd been leaving windows open to try to get some air circulation. I was in the garden that evening when I heard voices drifting down from his window, clear enough to make out actual words for the first time. Someone was giving directions, not navigation directions, but instructions about movements, positions, actions. The voice was calm and methodical, like someone reading from a script or manual. I couldn't make out the responses, but there were definitely other people involved in whatever was happening up there. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of any immediate fear, but because something about the whole situation felt fundamentally wrong. The secretive behavior, the strange hours, the elaborate computer setup, the voices giving instructions. It all added up to something that went beyond normal antisocial behavior or work stress. I started researching online communities and activities that might explain what he was involved in. What I found made my stomach turn. There were references to hidden networks where people gathered for activities that operated outside normal boundaries, places where the worst impulses could be indulged without consequence. The descriptions were vague but deeply disturbing, suggesting interactive experiences where viewers could influence what happened to real people in real time. The realization that I might be living directly below someone participating in these networks was genuinely terrifying. The one-way conversations I'd overheard, the packages, the secretive behavior, it all suddenly made horrible sense. He wasn't just watching something disturbing. He was actively participating, making requests that were being carried out somewhere else, to someone else. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that there could be innocent explanations for everything I'd observed. But the combination of evidence was too strong to ignore, and the descriptions I'd found online matched his behavior too precisely to be coincidental. Sleep became almost impossible. every sound from his room took on sinister significance. Every conversation I overheard seemed to confirm my worst suspicions. I'd lie awake wondering what exactly was happening above me, who might be suffering because of activities being coordinated from our house. The knowledge that these networks existed, that people participated in them from ordinary houses in ordinary neighborhoods, fundamentally changed how I saw the world around me. Every house could be hiding similar activities. Every antisocial neighbor could be involved in things that shouldn't be possible in civilized society. I started noticing details about other houses on our street that I'd never paid attention to before. Which ones had unusual amounts of electronic equipment? Which residents kept irregular hours? Which properties received frequent deliveries or had visitors at strange times? The suburban normality that had always felt safe and predictable now seemed like a facade hiding darker realities. The authorities seemed completely unaware of what was happening. Police patrols continued their regular routes, completely oblivious to the networks operating parallel to their understanding of crime and disorder. The gap between official awareness and actual activity was enormous, leaving people like me with knowledge we couldn't act upon and evidence we couldn't report. I considered moving out, but that felt like abandoning responsibility for what I'd discovered. If these activities were happening in our house, involving our internet connection and our address, then walking away would make me complicit in whatever harm was being caused. But staying meant living with knowledge that was eating away at my ability to function normally. The situation resolved itself when he disappeared. Or that's what we told ourselves. The truth is, we're not entirely sure what happened. His presence in the house became increasingly sporadic, then stopped entirely. But none of us could pinpoint exactly when we'd last seen him. One day, we realized his room had been silent for over a week, and when we finally worked up the courage to check, it was empty. But the emptiness felt wrong somehow. His belongings were gone, but selectively. Personal items had vanished while leaving behind things that suggested a hurried departure. The room had been cleaned, but not thoroughly, as if someone had tried to remove evidence rather than simply tidy up. Most disturbing were the scratches on the walls near the window, thin marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. The house felt different after he left, not just quieter or less crowded, but somehow cleaner, like a source of contamination had been removed. The internet connection returned to normal. The electricity bills dropped back to reasonable levels, and the strange packages stopped arriving. Life returned to the mundane routine that had existed before. But the knowledge remained. Understanding that these networks exist, that ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty, that such activities happen in normal houses, in normal neighborhoods. The innocent world I'd lived in before had been permanently damaged by what I'd learned. Sometimes I wonder if he moved to another house with other unsuspecting housemates, or if the activities I'd witnessed were part of a larger network that continues to operate from locations across the country. The infrastructure exists, the participants are out there, and the demand for such content apparently continues to grow. I still live in shared houses, still split bills and argue about cleaning rotas and wonder about my housemates' odd behaviors. But now I pay attention to different details, notice different patterns, and ask different questions about the sounds that come from other people's rooms after midnight. I've always been a bit of a loner, which suited me fine growing up. While other kids were obsessing over football or hanging around shopping centres, I preferred reading in my room or exploring the countryside around our village. My parents worried I was too antisocial, but I just found books more fascinating than most people. That love of reading followed me to university in Bristol, where I studied English literature and spent most of my free time in the library or local bookshops. I wasn't completely isolated. I had a few friends on my course and occasionally went out for drinks, but I was never really part of the social scene that seemed to consume most students' lives. By my final year, I developed quite specific tastes in literature. I was particularly drawn to obscure Victorian novels and early 20th century works that most people had never heard of. The sort of books that existed in tiny print runs and were now nearly impossible to find except in specialist collections or rare book dealers. That's how I discovered underground book trading communities. It started when I was trying to track down a particular novel by a forgotten author whose work had caught my attention during my dissertation research. The book had been published in a limited edition in 1923, and copies were extraordinarily rare. The few I could find through legitimate antiquarian book dealers were priced at several £100s, completely beyond my student budget. Someone on a literature discussion board mentioned that there were alternative communities where rare books could be found through less conventional channels. Not necessarily stolen or illegal, just networks of collectors and enthusiasts who traded items privately without going through official dealers or auction houses. I was skeptical at first, but curiosity got the better of me. After some searching, I found my way to sites that operated like specialized marketplaces for book collectors. The setup was similar to normal online trading platforms, but focused exclusively on rare, out-of-print, or otherwise hard-to-find literary works. Most of the books being offered were legitimately rare editions that sellers had acquired through estate sales, house clearances, or inherited collections. The prices were reasonable, often significantly cheaper than what established dealers charged, and the community seemed to be made up of genuine enthusiasts rather than commercial operators. I found several items I'd been looking for, including the 1923 novel that had started my search. The seller was helpful and knowledgeable, providing detailed descriptions of the book's condition and provenance. When it arrived, it was exactly as described. A genuine first edition in remarkable condition for its age. Over the next few months, I became a regular participant in these book trading communities. I bought several rare editions for my collection and even sold a few duplicates I had acquired over the years. The other members were knowledgeable and passionate about literature, exactly the sort of people I enjoyed discussing books with. But gradually, I began noticing that some sections of these communities dealt with more than just rare books. There were private groups within the larger community that required special access and dealt with what they called exclusive materials. The descriptions were vague, but they seemed to be offering items that went beyond normal rare book collecting. Manuscripts, personal papers, even unpublished works by famous authors. When I inquired about joining these exclusive groups, I was told that membership required recommendations from existing members and demonstrated commitment to serious literary scholarship. They explained that some of the materials they dealt with were sensitive or controversial, requiring discretion and careful handling. That explanation made sense for genuinely important literary discoveries. Unpublished manuscripts or personal correspondence from famous authors would need to be handled carefully to protect both their value and the privacy of any living relatives or estate holders. I was eventually invited to join one of these exclusive groups after several established members vouched for my knowledge and discretion. The selection process was thorough, including detailed questions about my academic background and research interests. The exclusive group dealt with materials that were genuinely extraordinary. Unpublished poems by well-known authors, personal letters between famous literary figures, even early drafts of novels that showed how classic works had evolved during the writing process. The sort of items that would be invaluable to serious scholars, but would never be made available through conventional academic channels. Most of these materials had been acquired through private collectors who preferred to keep their transactions confidential, estate executors who wanted to sell items quickly without the publicity that major auction houses would generate, families who had inherited literary collections but wanted to avoid the complicated legal and tax implications of donating them to institutions. The group's members included university professors, independent researchers, and serious collectors who were genuinely committed to preserving and studying important literary works. The discussions were intelligent and well-informed, focusing on the historical and scholarly significance of the materials being offered. But as I became more involved with the group, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. Some of the materials being offered seemed to have unclear or questionable provenance. Items that sellers claimed to have acquired through legitimate channels, but couldn't provide detailed documentation about how they'd obtained them. Manuscripts that had supposedly been discovered in private collections, but matched descriptions of items that had been reported missing from institutional libraries. When I raised concerns about this, other group members explained that provenance documentation was often incomplete for materials that had been in private hands for decades. Many important literary items had been acquired informally over the years, and expecting modern standards of documentation for historical transactions was unrealistic. That explanation was reasonable up to a point, but I began to suspect that some sellers were deliberately obscuring the origins of their materials to avoid awkward questions about how they'd been acquired. More troubling were the types of materials that some group members were specifically seeking. Rather than looking for items related to their stated research interests, some buyers seemed to be commissioning thefts of particular items from known collections. They would provide detailed descriptions of specific manuscripts or books, along with information about which libraries or private collections currently held them. Then they would wait for sellers to offer those exact items, often within surprisingly short timeframes. The pattern suggested that some group members were essentially placing orders for materials they wanted, stolen from legitimate owners. When I tried to discuss these concerns with other members, I found that the group had strict rules about questioning other members' activities or the legitimacy of materials being offered. Such discussions were considered disruptive to the community and could result in membership being revoked. The group also had elaborate security measures that seemed excessive for a community of book collectors. All communications were heavily secured. Members used pseudonyms rather than real names, and there were strict protocols about maintaining anonymity and avoiding any activities that might attract attention from law enforcement. I began to realize that I'd gotten involved with something much more serious than enthusiastic book collecting. Some group members were clearly involved in systematic theft of rare books and manuscripts from libraries, universities, and private collections. They used the community's scholarly reputation and academic discussions to provide cover for what was essentially organized crime, focused on high-value cultural artifacts. The exclusive materials weren't just rare. They were stolen goods being traded among people who used their knowledge of literature to identify and acquire valuable items through illegal means. But extricating myself from the group wasn't straightforward. I'd been participating for several months and had purchased items that might have been stolen from legitimate owners. Even if I'd done so unknowingly, I could potentially be charged with receiving stolen goods if law enforcement investigated the group's activities. More concerning was the group's emphasis on maintaining secrecy and protecting member identities. People who left the community under suspicious circumstances were treated as potential security threats, and there were hints that former members had experienced various forms of harassment designed to ensure their continued silence. I decided to gradually reduce my participation while being careful not to raise suspicions about my reasons for withdrawing. I stopped making purchases, participated less in discussions, and began distancing myself from the group's activities. But I also started documenting what I'd observed, building a record of the group's operations that might be useful if I ever needed to provide evidence to law enforcement about their activities. What I discovered was that the book theft operation was much larger and more organized than I'd initially realized. The group I'd been involved with was just one part of a network that specialized in stealing and trading cultural artifacts from institutions across the UK and Europe. They had members with access to university libraries, museum collections, and private archives. Some were employees who could access materials legitimately, while others were specialists in bypassing security systems and accessing restricted areas without authorization. The network also included people with expertise in document authentication, book restoration, and even forgery. They could modify stolen items to obscure their origins, create false provenance documentation, and repair damage that might have occurred during theft. Most disturbing was evidence that some network members specifically targeted vulnerable institutions with inadequate security or poor inventory management. They would identify libraries or collections where items could be stolen without being quickly noticed, then systematically remove valuable materials over extended periods. Some university libraries had apparently lost hundreds of rare books and manuscripts without realizing the extent of the theft, because the criminals were careful to target items that weren't frequently accessed and might not be missed for months or years. I tried to contact some of the institutions that appeared to have been targeted, but explaining how I'd learned about the thefts would require admitting my involvement with the criminal network. Without concrete evidence of specific stolen items, most librarians were reluctant to take my concerns seriously. The few who did investigate found exactly what I'd expected: valuable items missing from their collections, with no clear record of when or how the thefts had occurred, but proving that these items had been stolen by the network I'd been involved with would require much more comprehensive investigation than individual institutions could undertake. Meanwhile, I continued to receive communications from the book trading group, despite my reduced participation. Messages about new materials being offered, invitations to exclusive events, and requests for recommendations about potential new members. The group seemed reluctant to accept that I was simply losing interest in their activities. Some communications hinted that they were concerned about my withdrawal and wanted to ensure I remained committed to maintaining the community's confidentiality. When I failed to respond to several messages, I started receiving more direct contact from group members. Phone calls to numbers I'd never given them, emails to addresses I hadn't used for group communications, even what appeared to be surveillance of my daily activities around Bristol. They clearly had much more information about my real identity and personal circumstances than I'd realized, despite the community's emphasis on anonymity and security. That suggested the group's security measures were designed to protect the organizers while making ordinary members vulnerable to monitoring and control. They'd been gathering information about participants that could be used for blackmail or intimidation if anyone tried to expose their operations. I realized I was in a much more dangerous situation than I'd understood. Not only had I potentially committed crimes by purchasing stolen materials, but I now possessed information about a criminal network that had demonstrated their willingness to threaten and harass people who posed risks to their operations. Simply trying to withdraw from their activities might not be enough to ensure my safety. if they considered me a security threat, they might take more serious action to prevent me from exposing what I'd learned about their methods and targets. I started taking precautions around my daily routine, varying my routes between university and home, being more careful about who I shared personal information with, even considering whether I should report everything to police despite the potential legal consequences for myself. But I also knew that the evidence I'd gathered about their book theft operations was probably important enough to justify the risks involved in exposing them. Cultural institutions across the country were losing irreplaceable materials to organized criminals who treated priceless literary works as commodities to be bought and sold. The question was whether I could find a way to provide information to law enforcement without destroying my own life in the process. That question became much more urgent when I discovered someone had been inside my student accommodation. I came back from lectures one afternoon to find subtle signs that my room had been searched. Nothing obviously disturbed, but books rearranged slightly, drawers that weren't quite closed properly, even my laptop repositioned on my desk. Someone had been through my possessions carefully and professionally, looking for evidence of what I might know about the book theft network. They'd probably found exactly what they were looking for. My research notes about the group's activities, copies of communications with other members, even photographs I'd taken of some of the rare books I'd purchased that might help identify stolen materials. Now they knew I'd been documenting their operations and posed a serious threat to their continued activities. I had maybe hours before they decided how to deal with that threat. I've never been particularly ambitious, which probably sounds like a character flaw, but has actually served me quite well. Growing up in Sunderland with parents who both worked in factories, I learned early that steady work and reliable income mattered more than chasing dreams that might never materialize. After finishing my history degree, I ended up doing delivery driving around the Northeast. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid reasonably well and offered flexibility. I'd worked for most of the major delivery companies, Amazon, DPD, Hermes, but the pay was pretty grim once you factored in fuel costs and vehicle maintenance. That's how I found Special Courier Services, a company that specialized in handling unusual or high-value deliveries that mainstream firms wouldn't touch. Their website advertised discreet delivery services for clients who needed guaranteed security and confidentiality for sensitive shipments. The application process was thorough. Beyond standard background checks, they wanted detailed references and specific questions about my availability for urgent or out-of-hours deliveries. They explained that clients often had time-sensitive requirements that couldn't wait for normal business hours. The pay reflected these demands, often double what mainstream companies offered. My first assignment was delivering legal documents between solicitor offices. The pickup and delivery procedures were elaborate. Specific identification requirements, signed receipts with detailed timestamps, even photographs of packages being handed over. But the money was excellent and the work was straightforward. After a few weeks, I started receiving different types of assignments. Some clients wanted items collected from residential addresses. Others required deliveries at specific times to people waiting at predetermined locations rather than fixed addresses. These assignments paid even better, often several £100s for apparently simple tasks. But I began noticing inconsistencies. Some packages were clearly much heavier than documents would be, despite similar packaging. Others had unusual shapes that suggested they contained items other than paperwork. When I asked about contents, my coordinator explained that clients often used document-style packaging for small valuable items to avoid attracting attention during transport. Some collection addresses were residential properties that didn't seem consistent with the professional client base Special Courier claimed to serve. Delivery locations were designed to avoid permanent records. Car park meetings, motorway service stations, deliveries to people waiting at specific coordinates rather than addresses. The clients receiving deliveries often seemed nervous, checking that no one was observing handovers and sometimes aborting deliveries if they noticed anything suspicious. I started suspecting that packages contain items clients couldn't send through legitimate services. I researched special courier services and found troubling gaps. While officially registered, there was almost no information about their actual operations. Some collection addresses had connections to businesses investigated for fraud and illegal trading. Many packages seemed part of larger operations involving multiple drivers and complex logistics. I would sometimes arrive at collection points to find other special courier drivers picking up similar packages, all destined for different locations, but clearly part of a coordinated distribution systems. The scale suggested systematic distribution of materials requiring careful coordination to avoid law enforcement detection. I was probably transporting illegal goods, drugs, stolen items, counterfeit products, but proving this would require opening packages, violating confidentiality agreements, and risking serious legal consequences if contents were legitimate but sensitive. Meanwhile, assignments became more frequent and urgent. Clients requested immediate pickups with premium payments for same-day service. Some involved longer distances and complex multi-stop deliveries requiring overnight trips. The payments were substantial but meant deeper involvement in whatever system I was supporting. I started documenting assignment details, addresses, package descriptions, suspicious client behavior. This revealed the operation's scale. Hundreds of packages moved between dozens of locations across multiple regions, with careful coordination ensuring deliveries completed according to specific schedules and security protocols. The operation involved multiple courier companies and independent drivers, handling different segments of distribution chains that moved materials without creating traceable connections. I was part of a systematic criminal enterprise distributing illegal goods while minimizing detection risks. But understanding this didn't resolve my situation. I transported hundreds of potentially illegal packages. Even unaware of the operation's criminal nature, my involvement could be presented as evidence of knowing participation. The people running it had detailed information about my circumstances and willingness to handle questionable assignments without questions. When I started declining assignments, the coordinator contacted me directly, offering higher payment rates and emphasizing that reliable drivers were valuable assets the company was committed to retaining. The pressure felt excessive for a normal commercial relationship, more like concern about losing control over someone with inside knowledge. I researched other drivers who'd worked for Special Courier and found most had disappeared from courier work entirely. The pattern suggested the company either retained drivers long-term or ensured they stopped working in transport completely. Simply stopping work might not be sufficient. If they considered me a security risk, they might take direct action to ensure continued silence. The packages I transported contained evidence of serious crimes, which gave the company significant leverage due to my potential legal vulnerability. But continuing meant deeper involvement in activities that could result in more serious consequences if law enforcement identified the operation. I was trapped between the risks of continued involvement and the dangers of extraction from an organization with sophisticated methods for controlling essential service providers. The situation became urgent when I received an assignment involving transport from a location raided by police days earlier. The premises still showed signs of law enforcement activity. but clients were already arranging collection through alternative channels. The operation's speed in adapting to police pressure suggested experience dealing with investigations and robust methods for continuing activities even when locations were compromised. When I expressed concerns about collecting from recently searched premises, the coordinator reminded me of contractual obligations and emphasized the importance of maintaining service during difficult periods. They explained that temporary disruptions were common and drivers unwilling to adapt wouldn't be suitable for continued employment. They offered substantial bonus payments for assignments involving higher risks, but the implicit threat was clear: accept dangerous work or face consequences for refusing to support operations regardless of potential legal exposure. I was being offered financial incentives to transport materials from locations under police investigation. Potentially making me an accessory to crimes law enforcement was actively trying to prevent. The assignment was scheduled for the following morning, with collection from the raided premises and delivery to a location confirmed just hours before pickup. That evening, I noticed the same van parked outside my flat that I'd seen near several collection addresses while working for Special Courier Services. Do you ever rehearse something in your head before you say it, just to get an idea of how it'll sound? I did that with this story. It probably sounds like a strange way to begin, but there's a reason. I can't bring myself to properly clean my own house anymore. Every time I pick up a cloth or switch on the Hoover, I think about the things I found hidden inside other people's homes, and I start to wonder what might be buried in mine. What seemed like straightforward work ended up showing me how fragile privacy really is. The whole thing started when I answered an advertisement for domestic cleaning work in Stoke-on-Trent. I had been struggling to find steady employment after the care home where I worked closed down due to funding issues. The redundancy package had barely lasted 2 months, and I was facing the prospect of losing my flat if I couldn't find regular income soon. The cleaning job seemed ideal for my circumstances. The agency advertised flexible hours, above average pay, and the opportunity to work independently without constant supervision. They emphasized that they served a discerning clientele who valued discretion and reliability above all else. During the interview, the agency manager explained that their clients were typically busy professionals who traveled frequently for work. Many of their properties required maintenance cleaning while the owners were abroad, ensuring that homes remained pristine and secure during extended absences. The manager stressed that absolute discretion was essential for this type of work. Clients needed to trust that their homes would be treated with complete respect, and that any personal information encountered during cleaning would remain strictly confidential. She made it clear that discussing clients or their homes with anyone outside the agency would result in immediate termination. I was assigned to a rotation of about 6 different properties across Staffordshire and the West Midlands. All were substantial homes owned by people who apparently travelled extensively for business. The agency provided detailed cleaning schedules and specific instructions for each property, along with keys and alarm codes for access. The first few properties I cleaned were exactly as advertised. Well-maintained homes that showed signs of recent occupation, but were temporarily vacant while the owners travelled. The cleaning work was thorough but straightforward, focusing on maintaining the properties in pristine condition for the owner's return. However, I began noticing unusual aspects of these homes that didn't quite fit the profile of busy traveling professionals. Many contained personal belongings and living arrangements that suggested the owners had left suddenly rather than departing for planned business trips. Some properties had half-eaten meals still on tables, unopened mail accumulating by the front door, and cars parked in driveways that appeared to have been sitting unused for weeks. The homes felt abandoned rather than temporarily vacant, as if the occupants had simply vanished without making proper arrangements for their absence. When I mentioned these observations to the agency manager, she explained that many of their clients worked in high-stress industries where travel plans could change rapidly. Emergency business trips often required immediate departure, leaving little time for proper household arrangements. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for the apparent haste with which some clients had departed their homes. International business often involved urgent situations that required dropping everything to respond to crises or opportunities abroad. However, as I continued working for the agency, I noticed that the cleaning assignments involved tasks that went beyond typical domestic maintenance. I was asked to organize personal documents, inventory valuable items, and photograph certain rooms and belongings for what the agency described as insurance and security purposes. These additional responsibilities felt intrusive and unnecessary for basic cleaning services. When I questioned why document organization and property photography were required, the agency explained that their clients often needed assistance managing their affairs during extended absences. Many clients were elderly or had complex financial arrangements that required careful monitoring, while they were unable to oversee their properties personally. The agency provided comprehensive property management services that went beyond simple cleaning to include basic administrative support. This explanation seemed plausible for legitimate property management work, but the specific documents and items I was asked to photograph suggested interests that went beyond administrative assistance. I was documenting personal correspondence, financial records, and intimate family photographs that seemed irrelevant to property security. The agency began requesting more detailed reports about each property, including information about the personal lives and circumstances of the homeowners based on what I observed during cleaning. They wanted to know about medication schedules, social relationships, and lifestyle patterns that could be determined from examining personal belongings. When I expressed discomfort with gathering such intimate information about the homeowners, the agency reminded me that understanding client circumstances was essential for providing appropriate property management services. Elderly or vulnerable clients often needed additional support that required awareness of their personal situations. Around the 6th week of my employment with the agency, I was assigned to clean a property that belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson. Unlike the other homes on my route, this property showed clear signs that the owner had not left voluntarily for business travel. The house contained evidence of a struggle, with furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered, and signs that someone had been searching through drawers and cabinets. The home felt like a crime scene, rather than a property requiring maintenance cleaning while the owner traveled. When I contacted the agency about the condition of Mrs. Henderson's home, they explained that she had suffered a medical emergency while preparing for a trip and had been hospitalized. The family had asked for emergency cleaning services to secure the property while they dealt with the medical crisis. This explanation seemed reasonable enough, but I was troubled by the specific cleaning instructions for Mrs. Henderson's property. Instead of focusing on tidying up after the medical emergency, I was asked to photograph all personal documents, inventory jewelry and valuables, and document any information about bank accounts or financial arrangements. These tasks felt more like systematic robbery than cleaning services for a family dealing with a medical emergency. I was essentially cataloging everything of value in the home and documenting personal information that could be used for identity theft or financial fraud. When I tried to refuse these expanded responsibilities, the agency pointed out that I had already been gathering similar information from other properties for several weeks. They reminded me that I had signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements that covered all aspects of the property management services I was providing. They also mentioned that I had gained access to sensitive information about multiple clients and their personal circumstances. This knowledge made me a valuable part of their operation, but it also meant that ending my employment would require careful consideration of security implications. The agency began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that they could not have gathered through our employment relationship. They made references to my financial difficulties, housing situation, and daily routine that suggested they had been conducting background research into my own life. This surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my activities and communications were being monitored. The agency was applying the same intelligence gathering techniques to my personal life that I had been using to gather information about their clients' circumstances. I realized that the cleaning work had been used to recruit me into systematic burglary and identity theft operations disguised as property management services. The homes I had been cleaning belonged to vulnerable people who had been targeted for exploitation, and I had been gathering the intelligence needed to rob them systematically. The properties weren't owned by traveling business professionals at all. They belonged to elderly or vulnerable people who had been removed from their homes through various means, allowing the agency to access their properties and personal information without interference. Mrs. Henderson's case was probably typical of how the operation worked. Vulnerable people were identified and their circumstances manipulated to create opportunities for accessing their homes and gathering information about their assets and personal lives. When I attempted to report my suspicions to the police, I discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The cleaning work had been presented as legitimate property management services. The confidentiality agreements I had signed covered various types of administrative assistance, and the personal information I had gathered could be justified as necessary for proper client care. The agency had structured their operations to make the systematic robbery and identity theft appear like legitimate property management work. Proving criminal intent would require evidence that went beyond what I could provide based on my limited knowledge of their overall operations. The agency continued to contact me for several months after I stopped working for them, offering additional cleaning assignments and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active. I never determined the full scope of their operations or what happened to the people whose homes I had been systematically cataloging. The combination of property access, personal intelligence gathering, and sophisticated methods for targeting vulnerable individuals suggested an organization capable of extensive financial and personal exploitation. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for recruiting people into criminal operations by presenting theft and fraud as legitimate employment opportunities. They understood how to exploit financial desperation to recruit accomplices who would provide detailed intelligence about potential victims' assets and vulnerabilities. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire for steady employment had been transformed into participation in systematic victimization of vulnerable people. The cleaning work had been a recruitment method designed to identify people desperate enough to ignore ethical concerns in exchange for regular income. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar property management companies, offering cleaning and administrative work that pays well for what appears to be basic domestic services. The positions they advertise always involve working with elderly or traveling clients, always require strict confidentiality, and always include responsibilities that go beyond typical cleaning work. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate property management services while actually participating in systematic robbery and exploitation of vulnerable homeowners. I used to think I was pretty good at staying out of trouble. Always handed assignments in on time, never got into fights, kept my head down and minded my own business. The sort of person teachers liked and parents approved of their kids hanging around with. That all changed when I started my second year at Leeds and got put in halls with Danny Morrison. Danny was one of those people who seemed to attract chaos wherever he went. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't violent or particularly reckless, just someone who always knew people who knew people, if you know what I mean. The type who could get you concert tickets when they were sold out, or help you find textbooks that had mysteriously fallen off the back of a lorry. I liked him well enough. He was funny, generous with his mates, and never pressured anyone to get involved with his various schemes. But living with someone means you inevitably get drawn into their world, even when you're trying to keep your distance from anything dodgy. It started small. Danny would get messages at weird hours, people calling him with requests for things that were hard to come by through normal channels. University accommodation with suspiciously short notice periods. Part-time jobs that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions about work permits. Electronics that were significantly cheaper than high street prices, assuming you weren't fussy about receipts or warranties. Most of his business seemed to involve connecting people who needed things with people who could provide them. A middleman operation that kept him just far enough removed from anything obviously illegal, while still making enough money to afford better clothes and nights out than most students could manage. I tried to stay uninvolved, but when you're living on beans and toast while your flatmate is ordering takeaways every night, it's hard not to be curious about how his income stream actually worked. Danny eventually explained that he operated through what he called alternative marketplaces. Websites that functioned like normal classified ads, but were set up to handle transactions that mainstream platforms wouldn't touch. He insisted that nothing was seriously criminal. It was simply a way for people to buy and sell items without having to navigate the bureaucracy required by legitimate businesses. He showed me some of the sites he used, and they looked professional enough. Clean layouts, user ratings, even customer service contact forms. The main difference from normal classified sites was that they were hosted on hidden web addresses that you couldn't access through standard browsers. The products themselves seemed fairly mundane. Electronics, clothing, textbooks, household items, the sort of stuff you'd find on any second-hand marketplace. The prices were good, sometimes suspiciously good, but nothing that screamed stolen goods to anyone who wasn't looking too closely. Danny's role was essentially customer service and logistics. He'd identify people who were looking for specific items, connect them with sellers who could provide them, and handle the complicated bits of arranging payment and delivery, taking a small commission from each transaction while keeping buyers and sellers anonymous from each other. It seemed like a fairly harmless way to make money, helping students and young people who couldn't afford retail prices to find the things they needed. Danny was careful about who he worked with, avoided anything that was stolen or dangerous, and made sure his customers knew exactly what they were getting into. But as I got more familiar with how these marketplaces operated, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. Some of the items being sold were clearly targeted at specific types of buyers. Electronics that had been modified in ways that served no obvious purpose except to make them harder to trace. Clothing and accessories that were described using terminology I didn't recognize, but that seemed to mean something specific to certain customers. More concerning were the services being offered alongside physical products. People's advertising skills and capabilities went well beyond simple buying and selling. Data recovery from damaged devices, document reproduction and verification, even what appeared to be identity verification services that could help people prove they were someone they weren't. Danny insisted that he stuck to straightforward retail transactions and didn't get involved with the more complicated services. But the boundaries seemed fluid, and I could see how easy it would be to gradually expand from selling second-hand electronics to helping people with more questionable requirements. The customer base was also more diverse than I'd initially realized. While many were obviously students and young people looking for bargains, there were also buyers who seemed to have serious money and very specific needs. People who were willing to pay premium prices for items that met particular requirements, even when cheaper alternatives were readily available. These higher-end customers often communicated through Danny, rather than dealing directly with sellers, apparently valuing the additional layer of anonymity he provided. They'd send detailed specifications for what they wanted, sometimes including technical requirements that seemed far more complex than anything a normal consumer would need. Danny started spending more time managing these premium customers, and I could see that the money involved was significantly larger than his usual transactions. Instead of making a few pounds commission on student textbooks, he was earning hundreds of pounds for arranging single transactions between serious buyers and specialized sellers. The work was also becoming more demanding. Premium customers expected rapid response times, detailed progress updates, and absolute discretion about their requirements. Danny found himself available at all hours, managing communications between people who operated in different time zones and had very specific ideas about how business should be conducted. But what really worried me was how paranoid he was becoming about security. Danny had always been reasonably careful about his online activities, using VPNs and avoiding leaving obvious traces of his marketplace involvement. But his security measures were becoming much more elaborate, suggesting that he was dealing with people who took anonymity very seriously indeed. He started using multiple phones, different laptops for different types of business, even separate internet connections that he paid for with cash, to avoid any link to his real identity. His room began to look like something from a spy film, with various devices and cables that seemed designed to make his online activities as untraceable as possible. When I asked why all this security was necessary for what he claimed was just second-hand retail, Danny explained that some of his customers were prominent people who couldn't afford to be associated with alternative marketplaces. Business executives, politicians, celebrities, people who needed to maintain public reputations but sometimes required access to products or services that weren't available through conventional channels. That explanation made sense up to a point, but it also raised questions about what exactly these prominent people were buying that required such elaborate secrecy. If it was just discounted electronics or designer clothing, why would they care about being associated with second-hand marketplaces? I started paying closer attention to the messages Danny received from his premium customers, trying to understand what kind of products and services were worth paying such high commission rates for. The requests were often vague, described in terminology that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify what was actually wanted. Customers would ask for documentation packages or verification materials without specifying what these items were supposed to verify. They'd request consultation services or technical assessments without explaining what kind of expertise they needed. But occasionally, the requests were specific enough to be genuinely disturbing. People wanted detailed background information about individuals they claimed to be considering for business partnerships. Others requested access to private social media accounts or email addresses belonging to people they said were involved in legal disputes with them. Some customers wanted help acquiring items that belonged to specific individuals, providing addresses and descriptions that suggested they were planning targeted thefts. Danny insisted that he only handled the communications and logistics, never getting directly involved with whatever his customers actually did with the products or services they purchased. But it was becoming clear that some of these transactions were facilitating activities that went far beyond simple retail commerce. The most concerning development was when customers started requesting information about people in our local area. They'd provide names, addresses, and personal details about individuals living in Leeds, asking for verification services or background research that required someone with local knowledge and access. Danny began receiving requests to visit specific addresses, photograph particular properties, even gather information about people's daily routines and habits. These local reconnaissance requests paid extremely well, often several £100s for what appeared to be straightforward information gathering. But they also meant that Danny was now directly involved in activities that looked suspiciously like stalking or preparation for criminal activity. When I confronted him about this, Danny claimed that the information was being used for legitimate purposes: due diligence for business investments, background checks for potential employees, research for legal proceedings. But he admitted he had no way of verifying what his customers actually did with the intelligence he provided. More troubling was his acknowledgement that some of the people he'd been asked to investigate had subsequently experienced problems. Houses that had been burglarized, cars that had been vandalized, individuals who had received threatening messages or experienced identity theft. Danny insisted these were coincidences, that correlation didn't prove causation, and that he was just providing information that was probably available through other sources anyway. But the pattern was becoming too consistent to ignore. I tried convincing him to stop taking the local reconnaissance requests, pointing out that he could be charged as an accessory if any of his customers used the information to commit serious crimes. But the money was too good, and Danny argued that someone else would just take the work if he turned it down. That's when I started documenting everything I could about his operations. I began keeping records of the customers he worked with, the types of requests he received, and their outcomes for people who had been investigated or targeted, building a file that might be useful if I ever needed to distance myself from his activities or provide evidence to authorities. What I discovered was that Danny's operation was much larger and more organized than he'd admitted. He wasn't just a freelance middleman handling occasional transactions. He was part of a network that specialized in providing intelligence and access services to clients who couldn't or wouldn't use legitimate channels. The network included people with skills in surveillance, data recovery, social engineering, and physical security. Customers could commission comprehensive investigations that included online research, physical reconnaissance, and even direct approach operations designed to extract information from targets. Danny's role was primarily handling local operations in the Leeds area, but he was connected to similar operatives in other cities who could provide coverage across the UK. The organization was sophisticated enough to handle complex multi-stage investigations that required coordination between different specialists and geographic regions. Most disturbing was the evidence that some customers were using these services to target vulnerable individuals for exploitation or harm. People in financial distress who could be manipulated into fraudulent schemes. Elderly individuals whose personal information could be used for identity theft. Young people who could be approached and recruited for various types of criminal activity. I realized that by living with Danny and keeping quiet about his operations, I was potentially complicit in facilitating serious crimes against innocent people. Even if I wasn't directly involved in gathering intelligence or providing services, My silence was enabling activities that were destroying other people's lives. But confronting Danny directly seemed increasingly dangerous. He'd become paranoid about security breaches and was constantly worried about being exposed by customers or competitors. Anyone who posed a threat to his operation was seen as a serious liability that needed to be dealt with. I started making plans to move out of our shared accommodation and distance myself from his activities entirely. But I also knew that simply walking away wouldn't protect me if Danny's customers decided I knew too much about their operations. The people he worked with had demonstrated their willingness to target individuals who posed threats to their interests. And as someone who'd been living with one of their operatives for months, I'd inevitably learn details about their methods and customers that could be damaging if disclosed to authorities. I was trapped between staying involved with activities I knew were harmful and trying to extract myself from a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. That's when Danny disappeared. I came back from lectures one afternoon to find his room completely cleared out, all his equipment gone. No note or explanation about where he'd gone or when he might be back. The only trace of his occupancy was a faint smell of cleaning products that suggested someone had worked very hard to remove any evidence of what had been happening in that room. I tried contacting him through the various phone numbers and email addresses I had, but they'd all been disconnected or abandoned. His social media accounts had been deleted, his university enrollment had been terminated, and none of our mutual friends had heard from him since the day he'd vanished. It was as if Danny Morrison had simply stopped existing. The university housing office eventually assigned me a new flatmate, a quiet engineering student who showed no interest in alternative marketplaces or questionable income streams. Life returned to something approaching normal, and I tried to convince myself that Danny's disappearance was just him moving on to better opportunities elsewhere. But I kept monitoring the hidden marketplaces where he'd operated, looking for signs that his network was still active in the Leeds area. What I found was that the services he'd provided were definitely continuing, but with different operatives handling local operations. New people were offering reconnaissance and intelligence services using the same terminology and methods that Danny had employed. The customer base seemed unchanged, and the types of requests being fulfilled were just as concerning as before. Someone had simply replaced Danny in the network's organizational structure, taking over his customer relationships and operational responsibilities without missing a beat. That suggested his disappearance hadn't been voluntary. Either he'd been eliminated because he'd become a security risk, or he'd been reassigned to different duties that required him to adopt a completely new identity. Either way, it meant that the people running this network were serious enough about operational security to make their own operatives disappear when necessary. And as someone who knew details about their methods and customers, I was probably next on their list of potential security risks that needed to be managed. I probably should have minded my own business when I noticed that our bin collection was happening on the wrong day. But once you start questioning things like that, you end up discovering answers you really didn't want to know. It was a Tuesday morning in November when I spotted the bin lorry working its way down our street. Nothing unusual about that, except our bins are normally collected on Thursdays, and had been for the 3 years I'd lived in this house. I only noticed because I'd forgotten to put mine out and was annoyed with myself for missing collection day. But when I looked outside, all the bins were still there from Monday night, exactly where people had left them. The lorry wasn't collecting refuse at all. The crew were photographing the contents of each bin, taking detailed pictures of what people had thrown away before moving on to the next house. I watched from my kitchen window as they worked systematically down the street, spending several minutes at each property documenting whatever was visible in the bins. They had proper equipment for the job, high-quality cameras, clipboards for notes, even what looked like evidence bags for collecting specific items. At first, I assumed this was some kind of council initiative. Maybe they were conducting waste audits to improve recycling rates, or gathering data about household disposal habits for environmental planning. Local authorities do all sorts of surveys that residents never hear about until the results are published. But something about the way they worked seemed too thorough and secretive for routine council business. They were careful to avoid being seen by residents, working quickly when people appeared at windows, and clearly trying to complete their documentation without attracting attention. When I tried calling the council to ask about waste monitoring programs in our area, they had no knowledge of any surveys being conducted and seemed confused about why someone would be photographing bin contents without notifying residents. That made me start paying closer attention to what was happening during our supposed bin collections, and I began noticing details that definitely weren't part of normal refuse service. The crew were collecting specific items from certain bins, placing them in separate containers rather than the main body of the lorry. They seemed to know exactly which houses to target and what they were looking for, suggesting this wasn't random sampling, but systematic collection based on prior intelligence. Most concerning was that they were taking items that clearly had personal significance. Photographs, documents, even clothing that people had discarded. The sort of things that could provide detailed information about household occupants and their personal circumstances. I realized that our weekly bin collection was being used as cover for systematic intelligence gathering about local residents, with discarded personal items being harvested for purposes that had nothing to do with waste management. But understanding what was happening didn't immediately clarify who was behind this operation or what they planned to do with the personal information they were collecting from people's rubbish. I started researching whether other areas had experienced similar fake bin collections, hoping to understand the scope of what appeared to be systematic surveillance disguised as routine municipal services. What I found led me to websites that specialized in providing intelligence gathering services for various clients who needed detailed information about specific individuals or communities. The sites offered comprehensive profiling services based on analysis of discarded materials, with detailed breakdowns of what could be learned about people's lives, relationships, financial circumstances, and personal habits through systematic examination of their household waste. But these weren't legitimate investigation services working for law enforcement or established institutions. The platforms operated through hidden channels that avoided normal regulatory oversight, providing intelligence to clients who couldn't obtain this information through legal methods. The fake bin collection service was apparently one method among many for gathering personal intelligence that could be sold to people who wanted detailed information about specific individuals for purposes ranging from stalking to financial fraud. Discarded mail, photographs, personal documents, and even food packaging could offer detailed information about people's daily routines, relationships, health conditions, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by clients with various criminal intentions. But the most disturbing aspect was that this intelligence gathering was being conducted under perfect cover, using municipal services that residents expected and trusted to facilitate systematic invasion of privacy that would be nearly impossible to detect or prevent. People were unknowingly providing detailed information about their personal lives every week when they put their bins out for collection, never realizing that their discarded materials were being systematically harvested and analyzed by people who specialized in using this intelligence for harmful purposes. The fake refuse collection was probably just one part of larger operations that used various municipal and commercial services as cover for intelligence gathering that facilitated systematic targeting of residents for criminal purposes. But proving what was happening would require evidence that would be difficult to gather safely, since the people responsible had clearly developed sophisticated methods for conducting surveillance while maintaining the appearance of legitimate municipal services. Meanwhile, the intelligence gathering was probably continuing throughout the area, with new personal information being collected weekly from residents who remained unaware that their discarded materials were being systematically harvested and analyzed. I started being much more careful about what I put in my household bins, shredding documents that contain personal information, and disposing of sensitive materials through other methods that wouldn't make them available for collection by unauthorized individuals. But I also realized that most residents would never become aware of the systematic intelligence gathering that was being conducted through their weekly refuse collection, continuing to discard personal materials without understanding that they were providing detailed information about their lives to people who specialized in exploiting such intelligence. The bin collection that was supposed to be a routine municipal service had instead become a systematic method for gathering personal intelligence that could be used to facilitate various types of criminal targeting against residents who had no idea their privacy was being systematically violated. When I tried to warn neighbors about the fake refuse collections, most seemed skeptical about the possibility that such systematic surveillance could be conducted without official knowledge or authorization. The idea that municipal services could be infiltrated or impersonated for criminal intelligence gathering seemed too sophisticated and organized for most people to accept as a realistic threat to their personal privacy and security. But the intelligence gathering was probably continuing regardless of whether residents believed it was happening, with comprehensive personal profiles being built from discarded materials that people assumed would be safely destroyed through normal waste processing. Every week, when I saw the bins being collected, I wondered whether other residents were starting to notice the unusual attention their refuse was receiving, or whether the systematic intelligence gathering would continue indefinitely without detection. The refuse lorry that appeared on our street each Tuesday looked exactly like legitimate council vehicles, staffed by people who appeared to be normal municipal workers conducting routine collection services that residents had no reason to question or examine closely. You know how sometimes you lose touch with people and wonder what happened to them? Well, I found out what happened to my old flatmate, and I really wish I hadn't. I was trying to find someone who could make me a fake ID. Nothing serious, just something that would get me into pubs without having to carry my passport around Manchester. My real driving license had been stolen along with my wallet, and getting a replacement was taking weeks because of some bureaucratic nonsense with DVLA. Someone at uni had mentioned there were places online where you could get decent fake documents made. So I spent a few evenings browsing hidden sites that specialized in that sort of thing. Most were obvious scams, asking for hundreds of pounds up front. But eventually, I found what looked like a legitimate service run by someone who actually knew what they were doing. The site was simple but professional. Examples of their work, pricing for different types of documents, even customer reviews that seemed genuine. What caught my attention was that they offered to meet clients in person for document handovers, which seemed safer than trusting the post with something like a fake ID. The person running the operation called themselves Dockmaster and claimed to be based in the Northwest. When I sent an inquiry about getting a driving license made, they responded quickly with details about their process and pricing, about £80 for a basic fake that would pass casual inspection, more if you wanted something that could fool professional scrutiny. But it was the photograph on their profile page that made me do a double take. The image showed someone's hands holding a newly printed driving license, demonstrating the quality of their work. But I recognized the hands immediately. The scar across the knuckles from when Jake had punched the window during Freshers Week. The distinctive silver ring he always wore on his middle finger. Jake had been my flatmate for 8 months before he vanished. He was studying business at Manchester Met, was always short of money, and was constantly looking for ways to make quick cash without having to get a proper job. He'd tried everything from selling energy drinks at raves to offering essay writing services to international students. Then one day in February, he'd simply disappeared. Left his room exactly as it was, didn't take any clothes or personal belongings, just stopped coming home. His phone went straight to voicemail. His university login hadn't been used, and his bank account showed no activity after the day he vanished. I'd reported him missing after a week, but the police weren't particularly interested. Young men disappeared from shared accommodation all the time, they said. Usually it was drugs, or debt, or family problems they didn't want to discuss. Most of them turned up eventually, living rough, or staying with friends they hadn't told anyone about. But Jake hadn't seemed like someone who would run away from problems. He was actually quite sensible about money and relationships, never got involved with anything too risky or illegal. The sudden disappearance was completely out of character for someone who usually overthought every decision. Now I was looking at what appeared to be his hands in a photograph advertising illegal document services. Either he was alive and working as a forger, or someone else was using his identity to run a criminal operation. I decided to place an order with Dogmaster to see if I could learn more about who was really behind the service. I submitted my photograph and personal details, explaining that I needed the document quickly and was willing to meet in person to collect it. The response came back within hours, professional and businesslike. They could have the license ready within 3 days, and we could arrange to meet at a location in Manchester city centre. The handover would take place in a public area. They suggested the food court at the Arndale Centre during busy periods when there would be plenty of people around. What struck me was the writing style. The messages were formatted in exactly the same way Jake used to write emails, short paragraphs, specific punctuation habits, even the same tendency to over-explain simple instructions. If this wasn't Jake himself, it was someone who had studied his communication patterns very carefully. I agreed to the meeting and waited for further instructions about the exact time and location. Part of me hoped it would actually be Jake, that he'd somehow gotten involved with document forgery and would have a reasonable explanation for why he'd disappeared so suddenly. But another part of me worried that someone else was using his identity for reasons I didn't want to think about. The final message about the meeting contained details that convinced me this really was Jake. The suggested meeting point was a specific bench near the Waterstones in the Arndale Centre, the exact same spot where we'd arranged to meet during Freshers Week when he was helping me find accommodation. Nobody else would have known that location was significant to us. But if Jake was alive and operating as a document forger, why hadn't he contacted any of his friends or family? Why had he left all his possessions behind and allowed people to think he might be dead? And how had he acquired the skills and equipment needed to produce professional quality fake documents? I started researching what was involved in document forgery, trying to understand what kind of operation Jake might have gotten himself involved with. It wasn't just a matter of having a good printer and some cardstock. Producing convincing fake IDs required specialized equipment, access to security features, and knowledge of exactly how legitimate documents were constructed. Such a setup would cost thousands of pounds and take months to establish properly. This was not something a cash-strapped student could assemble independently, even if he possessed the technical knowledge. That suggested Jake was working for someone else, possibly someone who had recruited him for his clean background and lack of obvious criminal connections. Young men without records were valuable for operations that needed to maintain a legitimate front while conducting illegal business. But it also raised darker possibilities. Maybe Jake hadn't chosen to disappear at all. Maybe he'd been recruited against his will, or coerced into participating through threats against his family or friends. The document forgery operation might be just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that used missing persons as expendable workers. I tried to investigate potential connections between missing person cases, specifically seeking young men who had vanished from university accommodation under comparable circumstances. What I found was disturbing. Dozens of cases across different cities, all involving students who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind personal belongings and active social lives. Most of these cases had received minimal police attention, classified as voluntary disappearances unless there was evidence of violence or coercion. The missing persons were usually described as having financial problems or academic struggles that might motivate them to start fresh elsewhere. But the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone was systematically targeting vulnerable students, making them disappear in ways that wouldn't trigger serious investigations, and at least some of them were probably being forced to work in illegal operations like the document forgery service I discovered. The day of the meeting arrived, and I positioned myself in the Arndale Center early to observe the area around the designated meeting point. I wanted to see who showed up and whether they appeared to be working alone or as part of a larger group. At exactly the agreed time, someone approached the bench where we were supposed to meet. From a distance, it looked like Jake. Same height and build, similar clothing style, even the same way of walking that I'd observed during the months we'd shared accommodation. But when he got closer, I could see that something was wrong. His appearance was different in subtle ways. Hair cut shorter than he used to wear it, weight loss that made his face look gaunt, an overall demeanor that seemed more cautious and nervous than the confident person I remembered. Most disturbing was the way he kept checking his surroundings, constantly scanning the crowd as if he was expecting trouble or watching for specific people. This wasn't someone meeting a client for a routine business transaction. It was someone who felt threatened and was taking precautions against unknown dangers. I watched from across the food court as Jake waited for nearly 20 minutes, checking his phone repeatedly and growing increasingly agitated when nobody approached him. Eventually, he got up and walked away, moving quickly through the crowd toward one of the center's exits. I followed at a distance, trying to see where he was going without getting close enough to be noticed. He moved through the building like someone who knew exactly where the security cameras were positioned, taking routes that kept him out of direct surveillance as much as possible. Outside the Arndale Center, Jake headed toward the northern quarter, walking quickly and continuing to check behind him every few minutes. I stayed as far back as I could while keeping him in sight, but the streets were busy enough that following someone without being noticed was relatively easy. He led me to a small internet cafe on a side street, the kind of place that catered to people who needed anonymous online access. Through the window, I could see him settling at a computer terminal in the back corner, positioned so he could watch both the entrance and the street outside. I waited across the street for about an hour, watching the internet cafe and noting who else came and went. Most of the customers seemed to be using the place for legitimate purposes. Tourists checking email, students working on assignments, people who didn't have reliable internet access at home. but there were also a few individuals who behaved differently, using the computers for short periods and paying in cash before leaving quickly. People who seemed more concerned with anonymity than convenience, possibly conducting business they didn't want traced back to their normal internet connections. When Jake finally emerged from the internet cafe, he looked even more nervous than before. He spent several minutes standing in the doorway, scanning the street carefully before stepping outside. Then he walked quickly toward the tram station, moving like someone who needed to get away from the area as soon as possible. I decided not to follow him any further. If Jake was involved with people who made him this paranoid about surveillance, getting too close might put both of us in danger. Instead, I went into the internet cafe to see if I could learn anything about what he'd been doing during his visit. The manager was helpful when I explained that I was trying to locate a friend who might have been using their services. He couldn't provide specific details about what customers did online, but he confirmed that the person I described was a regular visitor who always paid cash and never stayed for more than an hour at a time. More interestingly, he mentioned that this customer always used the same computer terminal, the one in the back corner that Jake had chosen. That terminal was popular with people who valued privacy because it was positioned away from the main seating area and had additional software installed that provided better anonymity protection. This setup would be particularly useful for someone conducting illegal business online, such as running a document forgery service through dark web marketplaces. I tried contacting Dockmaster again through the original website, explaining that I'd been unable to attend the meeting due to unexpected circumstances. I asked if we could reschedule, hoping to get another chance to make contact with Jake in a safer environment. But this time, there was no response. The website remained active, still advertising document services and accepting new orders, but my messages to Dockmaster went unanswered. Either Jake had recognized me at the meeting and realized his cover was blown, or something had happened to prevent him from continuing to operate the service. Over the next few weeks, I kept monitoring the website to see if there were any changes or updates. The service remained available, but the response times for customer inquiries became longer and more inconsistent. Eventually, new orders stopped being accepted entirely, and the site displayed a message saying the service was temporarily unavailable due to technical difficulties. I tried visiting the internet cafe again, hoping to catch Jake during one of his regular sessions, but the manager said he hadn't seen him since the day I'd followed him there. Either he'd found a different location for his online activities, or he'd stopped using the service entirely. The most disturbing possibility was that Jake's employers had discovered his identity had been compromised and had decided to eliminate the security risk. People involved in serious criminal operations didn't usually tolerate workers who attracted unwanted attention, especially when those workers were supposed to be untraceable missing persons. I considered reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but explaining how I'd found Jake would require admitting to browsing illegal websites and attempting to purchase forged documents. And without concrete evidence that he was being held against his will, they might not take the information seriously. People often assumed that young men who disappeared and later turned up working in illegal operations had chosen that path voluntarily. Proving coercion or trafficking would require more evidence than just recognizing someone's hands in a photograph on a criminal website. I started monitoring missing person databases more systematically, looking for other cases that might be connected to the document forgery operation or similar criminal services. What I found suggested that Jake's situation wasn't unique. There were dozens of young men who had disappeared from universities and later been spotted in circumstances that suggested involvement with illegal activities. However, The majority of these sightings were brief and inconclusive. People thought they'd seen missing persons in different cities, working in shops or restaurants, but the individuals had disappeared again before any contact could be made, as if someone was systematically moving them around to prevent them from being tracked down by friends or family. The document forgery website eventually went offline entirely, replaced by an error message claiming the domain had expired. But similar services continued to operate on other sites, offering the same types of illegal documents with the same professional quality and customer service standards. I sometimes wonder if Jake is still out there somewhere, working for people who use missing persons as expendable labor in criminal operations, whether he chose to disappear or was forced into it, and whether he has any way of escaping from whatever situation he's gotten trapped in. The worst part is knowing that there are probably dozens of other families wondering what happened to their missing sons and brothers, never realizing that their loved ones might be alive, but unable to make contact because they're being held by people who profit from making inconvenient individuals disappear. People who understand that a missing person presumed dead is much more valuable than a living person who might eventually find a way to ask for help. I keep telling myself I should have just thrown that photo album away the moment I realized the pictures weren't from any holiday I'd ever taken. My mum died suddenly last March, and I've been slowly working through the process of sorting her belongings from the house in Blackpool, where she'd lived alone for the past decade. Most of it has been straightforward, if emotionally difficult. Clothes for charity shops, furniture that relatives might want, the usual accumulation of a lifetime that needs to be dealt with when someone passes away. But tucked away in a drawer in her bedroom, I found a photo album I'd never seen before. It was the old-fashioned kind with sticky pages and plastic covers, filled with what appeared to be holiday photographs from various trips and outings. At first glance, the photos seemed normal enough. Pictures of tourist attractions, countryside views, seaside promenades, the sort of snapshots that any pensioner might take during day trips or holidays. But as I looked more carefully, I started noticing details that didn't make sense. The photos showed places I recognized: York Minster, the Lake District, Brighton Pier. But they also showed me in these locations, apparently taken during visits I'd never made. There I was, standing in front of landmarks I'd never seen, wearing clothes I didn't remember owning, sometimes with people I didn't recognize. The strangest part was how natural and unposed I looked in these photographs, not like someone who was aware they were being photographed, but like candid shots taken during genuine leisure activities. But I had no memory of being in any of these places or doing the activities the photos showed. Initially, I wondered if I was looking at pictures of someone who resembled me closely. Maybe Mum had befriended someone who looked similar. Or perhaps there were family members I didn't know about who shared physical characteristics. But the person in the photographs was definitely me. Same height, same build, same distinctive scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. These weren't pictures of someone who looked like me. They were pictures of me in places I'd never been. I tried to think of rational explanations. Maybe I'd forgotten about family trips from years ago. Or perhaps these were photos from events I'd attended but hadn't paid much attention to. Memory can be unreliable, especially when it comes to routine outings that didn't seem significant at the time. But some of the photographs showed me in recent clothing and with a hairstyle I'd only adopted within the past 2 years. These weren't forgotten memories from decades past. They were apparently recent photos of activities I should definitely remember participating in. The implications were deeply unsettling. Either I was experiencing serious memory problems that were affecting my ability to recall significant portions of my recent life, or someone had been systematically photographing me without my knowledge during activities I wasn't aware I was participating in. I decided to research the locations shown in the photographs, hoping to find some trigger that might help me remember when and why I might have visited these places. When I started looking into some of the more distinctive backgrounds visible in the photos, I found references to locations that were connected to websites and services I'd never encountered before. Following these connections led me to platforms that seemed to exist outside normal internet browsing, places where people shared and traded photographs that appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge or consent. The platforms contained thousands of images showing ordinary people in various locations and activities, with detailed information about when and where the photographs had been taken. Most disturbing was that many subjects appeared to be unaware they were being photographed, captured during routine activities they probably assumed were private. Some photos were clearly taken from significant distances using telephoto lenses, while others appeared to have been captured during social situations where the subjects might have expected to be photographed but weren't aware of the specific images being taken. But what made me feel sick was finding additional photographs of myself among these collections. Images that weren't in Mum's album, but showed me during routine daily activities around my home area in Lancaster. Pictures of me walking to work, shopping for groceries, even sitting in my garden reading a book. All taken without my knowledge, from positions where the photographer would have been invisible to me, while I was going about my normal business. I realized that someone had been systematically surveilling and photographing me for an extended period, documenting both my routine activities and what appeared to be staged situations where I'd been unknowingly directed to specific locations for more elaborate photography sessions. The holiday photos in Mum's album weren't documenting trips I'd forgotten about. They were evidence that I'd been deliberately taken to various locations while unconscious or otherwise unaware, then photographed in ways that made these situations appear to be normal leisure activities. But understanding what had happened didn't immediately clarify who had been responsible or what methods they'd used to transport me to these locations without my knowledge or memory. The sophistication required to drug someone repeatedly, transport them to distant locations, photograph them in apparently natural poses, and return them home without leaving any conscious memory of these events suggested professional-level planning and resources. When I tried to research whether other people had experienced similar systematic photography and memory loss, I found scattered reports of individuals who discovered photographs of themselves in locations they couldn't remember visiting. Most had initially assumed they were experiencing memory problems or psychological issues, but investigation eventually revealed that they'd been targeted by operations that specialized in systematic surveillance and manipulation for purposes that weren't immediately clear to the victims. The operations seemed to focus on creating comprehensive photographic records of people's lives, including both routine activities and staged situations that required sophisticated planning and execution. But the most disturbing aspect was that many victims never discovered the full extent of their surveillance, only becoming aware when they accidentally encountered photographs that had been taken without their knowledge. The hidden platforms where these photos were traded contained much larger collections than what individual victims had discovered, suggesting that systematic surveillance and photography was happening to many more people than realized they were being documented. I was probably just one of many people who were being systematically photographed and surveilled, with most never becoming aware of the extent to which their lives were being documented and distributed through networks they couldn't access or monitor. The photo album I'd found in Mum's belongings had probably been placed there deliberately, possibly as part of whatever psychological manipulation was being conducted against me through this systematic surveillance. But proving what was happening would require evidence that was difficult to gather safely, since the people responsible had clearly demonstrated sophisticated capabilities for conducting surveillance while avoiding detection. Meanwhile, the photography and surveillance was probably continuing, with new images being captured regularly and added to collections that were traded through platforms designed to maintain anonymity and avoid law enforcement oversight. I never found any explanation for how Mum had obtained the photo album, or whether she'd been aware of the surveillance operation that was apparently targeting me. But I remained constantly aware that my daily activities were probably being photographed and documented by people whose purposes I couldn't understand and whose methods I couldn't detect or prevent. Every routine activity now felt potentially dangerous, knowing that people with sophisticated surveillance capabilities were systematically documenting my life while maintaining the ability to manipulate my memory and consciousness in ways that left no trace I could reliably detect. The photo album that was supposed to provide memories of Mum's life had instead revealed that my own life was being systematically documented and manipulated by people whose identity and motivations remained completely unknown to me. My anxiety got so bad during my final year at university that I ended up buying medication from someone online who turned out to be much more interested in my personal life than my prescription needs. I'd always been a bit of a worrier, but something about the pressure of final exams and job applications sent my mental health completely off the rails. Panic attacks in lectures, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, that constant feeling like something terrible was about to happen even when everything was fine. Classic anxiety symptoms that probably half the students at York were dealing with in their own ways. The obvious solution was to see a doctor and get proper medication, but the waiting list for mental health services was about 3 months long. The university counseling service was overwhelmed, private therapy was expensive, and meanwhile, I was supposed to be writing my dissertation and applying for graduate jobs while feeling like I was having a heart attack every time someone mentioned deadlines. A friend mentioned that there were ways to get anxiety medication without going through the official channels. Nothing dodgy, she insisted. Just people who could provide prescriptions for students who needed help urgently and couldn't wait for the NHS bureaucracy to catch up with demand. I was desperate enough to consider it. The panic attacks were getting worse, and I was starting to fall behind on coursework because I couldn't concentrate on anything except the constant worry that everything was going wrong. If I could just get something to take the edge off for a few weeks, maybe I could get through the final push to graduation. Finding these unofficial prescription services turned out to be easier than I'd expected. There were entire communities online dedicated to helping students and young people access medications that were difficult to obtain through conventional channels. Most operated through hidden websites that required specific addresses to access. The service I eventually contacted called itself Student Health Solutions and presented itself as a legitimate medical consultancy that specialized in providing rapid access to treatments for common student health problems. Their website looked professional, with information about qualified doctors and proper pharmaceutical suppliers. The consultation process seemed thorough and responsible. I filled out detailed forms about my medical history, symptoms, and previous treatments. I even had a video call with someone who claimed to be a qualified doctor, who asked intelligent questions about my anxiety and seemed genuinely concerned about finding appropriate treatment. The doctor explained that they could provide a short-term prescription for a mild anxiety medication that would help manage my symptoms while I waited for NHS treatment. The cost was reasonable, about £40 for a month's supply. and they guaranteed that the medication would be genuine pharmaceutical products rather than dodgy internet pills. When the medication arrived, it was exactly as described. Proper packaging, correct labeling, even an information leaflet, with all the standard warnings and dosage instructions. I started taking it according to the prescribed schedule and found that it genuinely helped with the anxiety symptoms. For the first time in weeks, I could focus on my dissertation without constant panic about deadlines and failure. The medication didn't solve everything, but it gave me enough breathing room to function normally while I worked on getting proper support through official channels. But after about a week, I started receiving follow-up communications from Student Health Solutions that seemed oddly personal for a medical consultancy. The doctor who had conducted my initial consultation sent regular check-in emails asking not just about how the medication was working, but about my daily routine, social activities, and personal relationships. He wanted to know where I was living, who I was spending time with, even details about my family background and financial situation. When I asked why this information was relevant to my medical treatment, he explained that anxiety often had complex social and environmental causes. Understanding my complete circumstances would help him provide more effective support and identify any factors that might be contributing to my symptoms. That explanation seemed reasonable for a holistic approach to mental health care, but the questions were becoming increasingly detailed and personal, going well beyond what seemed necessary for medical purposes. He wanted to know about my daily schedule in specific detail: what time I woke up, when I had lectures, where I ate meals, what route I took walking around campus. He asked about my relationships with flatmates, whether I felt safe in my accommodation, if I'd had any problems with other students or university staff. Most concerning were questions about my family's financial situation, my employment prospects after graduation, and whether I had any valuable possessions or access to money that might help with ongoing treatment costs. I started to suspect that the medical consultation was being used as cover for gathering information that had nothing to do with providing healthcare. When I tried to research Student Health Solutions more thoroughly, I found very little information about the organization beyond their professional-looking website. No registration with medical regulatory bodies, no physical address beyond a PO box, no verifiable credentials for the staff who claimed to be qualified doctors. The medication itself was genuine, but that didn't necessarily mean the people providing it were legitimate medical professionals. I decided to stop responding to the follow-up questions and just focus on using the medication I'd already received. But the communications from Student Health Solutions became more persistent and concerning. The supposed doctor started expressing worry about my mental health based on my reduced communication. He suggested that isolation and withdrawal were signs that my anxiety was getting worse and that I needed more intensive support than just medication. He offered to arrange in-person consultations at locations around York, claiming that face-to-face assessment would allow him to provide more effective treatment. When I declined, he seemed genuinely concerned that I was putting my health at risk by avoiding professional medical support. But he also started demonstrating knowledge about my activities that he couldn't have gained through our online communications. He mentioned seeing me around campus in specific locations, knew which coffee shops I'd been visiting, even referenced conversations I'd had with friends that he couldn't possibly have overheard, unless he'd been deliberately monitoring my activities. It was becoming clear that Student Health Solutions wasn't just providing informal medical consultations. They were using healthcare as a pretext for systematic surveillance of vulnerable students. I tried to research other people who might have used their services, looking for reviews or discussions about their treatment experiences. What I found was more disturbing than I'd expected. There were scattered reports from students who had received medication from similar services, but had subsequently experienced problems that seemed unrelated to their original health concerns. Identity theft, burglary, even stalking incidents that had started shortly after they provided personal information during medical consultations. Most concerning were cases where students had become dependent on their unofficial medication suppliers, unable to transition to legitimate NHS treatment because their informal providers had created complex psychological relationships that were difficult to break. Some students reported that their supposed doctors had gradually increased their involvement in personal decision-making, offering advice about relationships, career choices, and financial management that went far beyond medical treatment, creating dependent relationships where vulnerable young people relied on their medication providers for guidance about all aspects of their lives. I realized I was potentially being targeted by people who used fake medical services to identify and exploit vulnerable students. The anxiety medication was probably genuine, but it was being used as bait to establish relationships with young people who were dealing with mental health problems and might be susceptible to manipulation and control. I stopped taking the medication immediately and tried to cut all contact with Student Health Solutions. But they continued sending communications expressing concern about my welfare and offering various types of support that seemed designed to maintain some form of relationship. When I ignored their emails, they started using text messages and phone calls. The supposed doctor claimed he was worried about my mental health and felt professionally responsible for ensuring I received appropriate care. But the calls often came at times when I was alone in specific locations, suggesting that my activities were still being monitored, despite my attempts to end our professional relationship. Most disturbing was evidence that they had detailed information about my financial situation, academic performance, and family circumstances that I had never provided during the original consultation. They knew about my student loan balance, my parents' occupations, even my employment prospects after graduation. Someone had been conducting comprehensive background research into my personal life, using information that could only have been gathered through systematic surveillance or unauthorized access to official records. I started taking precautions around my daily routine, varying my schedule and being more careful about sharing personal information. But I also began to suspect that the surveillance had been going on much longer than I'd realized. Looking back at the original consultation process, I could see signs that Student Health Solutions had already known significant details about my circumstances before I'd contacted them. The questions they'd asked had been designed to confirm information they already possessed, rather than genuinely learning about my medical history. They had somehow identified me as a potential target before I'd even been aware that services like theirs existed. The friend who had recommended them might have been unknowingly part of a recruitment process designed to connect vulnerable students with people who specialized in exploiting their mental health problems. I tried contacting the friend who had originally mentioned the service, hoping to understand how she'd learned about them and whether she'd experienced similar problems. But she claimed not to remember giving me their details and seemed uncomfortable discussing anything related to unofficial healthcare services. When I pressed her for more information, she suggested that I might be confused about where I'd heard about Student Health Solutions and that maybe my anxiety was causing me to misremember recent events. Her response made me wonder whether she was genuinely confused or whether she'd been instructed to distance herself from the organization if anyone started asking awkward questions about how they recruited new clients. Either way, it was clear that I wasn't going to get help understanding the situation from people who had been involved in directing me towards Student Health Solutions in the first place. I considered reporting everything to the police, but explaining the situation would require admitting that I'd obtained prescription medication through illegal channels. even if the people providing it were running some kind of fraud or surveillance operation. I could potentially be charged with obtaining controlled substances without proper medical supervision. The legal risks of reporting the problem might be worse than the risks of simply trying to avoid further contact with the organization. But I also knew that other students were probably being targeted through similar schemes, and that the surveillance and manipulation tactics I'd experienced were likely being used against more vulnerable people who might be less able to recognize what was happening to them. Students dealing with serious mental health problems would be particularly susceptible to people who offered medical help while gradually gaining control over their personal lives and decision-making processes. I started monitoring online communities where students discussed mental health and informal healthcare options, looking for other people who might have encountered student health solutions or similar organizations. What I found was a pattern of reports from students who had received medication or treatment from unofficial providers, but had subsequently experienced various forms of harassment, exploitation, or identity theft. Most of these students had been in vulnerable situations when they'd first sought help, dealing with mental health crises, financial problems, or academic difficulties that made them desperate enough to consider alternatives to official support services. The fake medical providers had used their initial healthcare consultations to identify students who were isolated, financially insecure, or struggling with personal problems that made them susceptible to manipulation. Once they'd established relationships with vulnerable targets, they'd gradually expanded their involvement in those students' lives, offering various forms of support and guidance that created psychological dependence while gathering information that could be used for financial fraud or other criminal purposes. Some students had lost significant amounts of money to people who had gained their trust by providing medical help during mental health crises. Others had experienced identity theft, stalking, or harassment that had started after they'd shared personal information during fake medical consultations. The most disturbing cases involve students who had become completely dependent on their unofficial healthcare providers, unable to function independently because they'd been systematically isolated from legitimate support systems and convinced that only their fake doctors could provide effective treatment. I realized that Student Health Solutions was probably part of a larger operation that specialized in identifying and exploiting vulnerable young people through fake medical and support services. They used legitimate-seeming healthcare provision as a way to establish relationships with targets who were dealing with mental health problems, financial difficulties, or other vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to manipulation and control. The genuine medication they provided was just the initial hook used to establish trust and credibility. Once they'd gained access to their targets' personal lives, they could exploit that access for various criminal purposes while maintaining the appearance of being helpful healthcare providers. But understanding the scheme didn't necessarily protect me from its consequences. I'd already provided them with extensive personal information and had demonstrated that I was dealing with mental health problems that might make me a valuable long-term target. Even if I avoided further direct contact with Student Health Solutions, the information they'd gathered about me could be used for identity theft, fraud, or sold to other criminals who specialized in targeting vulnerable individuals. The surveillance of my daily activities was probably continuing, and the people behind the organization might decide that I posed a security risk if they suspected I was planning to expose their operations. I was trapped in a situation where seeking help for mental health problems had made me a target for criminals who specialized in exploiting people with exactly the vulnerabilities I'd been trying to address. The medication that was supposed to help me manage anxiety had instead created a much more serious and long-term threat to my safety and independence. And somewhere out there, other students were probably going through the same process, reaching out for help with mental health problems and unknowingly providing criminals with everything they needed to systematically destroy their lives. I didn't think anything of the package at first. Just a padded envelope, no markings, no return address. But when I flipped it over and saw the tape, identical to the one from before, I froze. I knew what it was. Before I opened it, before I even picked it up, I knew exactly what it was. This whole thing started with Sam. He wasn't a drug addict or anything like that. He just liked weird stuff, always had. If there was a limited edition or rare strain or some niche subreddit whispering about a plant you couldn't get on the regular market, he'd find it. That was kind of his thing. We'd met working the back shift at a call center. Just two guys taking breaks in the same smoke shelter every night. Over time, we started hanging out more. Shared music, talked about travel plans we'd never take, compared notes on which crypto wallets didn't suck. One night, he brought up the dark web. Not in a braggy way, just casually, like someone mentioning they'd bought a rare vinyl. He said he'd been browsing some lesser-known forums, looking for these exotic cannabis hybrids, stuff grown in places that didn't export, rare phenotypes with strange colors or effects. Some of it sounded made up, blue leaves, flour that smelled like rust. One supposedly gave you lucid dreams for 2 nights straight. I didn't think he'd actually buy anything. I mean, we've all clicked too far down a rabbit hole at 2 a.m., but that's different from actually putting in your address and waiting for a stranger to mail you drugs. But he did. I was there, actually, at his place. We'd just ordered Chinese. He had his laptop open and was clicking through a market page. One I hadn't seen before. Everything about it looked off. The fonts were weird. The prices weren't in dollars or euros. And the descriptions were long, poetic, almost cryptic. It didn't read like a vendor trying to sell a product. It felt more like someone offering an experience. He bought one labeled The Hollow Root. I remember that name because it didn't sound like weed. It sounded like something you'd find in a cursed field or buried in a temple wall. But he bought it anyway. Transferred some Monero. Got the confirmation. Closed the laptop. I laughed it off. Told him it probably wouldn't arrive, or if it did, it'd just be crushed oregano. But 5 days later, it showed up. That's when things changed. The envelope was thick, heavier than it should have been, wrapped in brown paper, taped with this strange patterned adhesive I'd never seen before. Gold markings over a red base, like something from a foreign postal system. Inside was a vacuum-sealed pouch and a smaller envelope, handwritten in a language neither of us recognized. It wasn't English, it wasn't French or Spanish, or anything European. The characters looked angular, stylized, Middle Eastern maybe, Arabic, I don't know. We looked it up online and couldn't find a match. The weed, if that's what it even was pitch black, like charcoal. It didn't even have the usual skunky smell. It was chemical, sharp, something between acetone and burnt leaves. I told him not to smoke it. I didn't like any part of this. He joked about it, but even he didn't seem entirely relaxed. That was the first time I saw hesitation in him. And he didn't hesitate often. He ended up trying it later that night after I left. Sent me a message saying it gave him the most vivid dreams he'd ever had. Said he saw people, places, sounds he didn't recognize, but that they felt real. After that, he changed. He kept his curtains shut during the day, barely answered his phone. He said he felt like he was being watched, that cars were slowing down near his building, that he'd seen the same man 3 days in a row, walking past his flat, wearing mirrored sunglasses even when it rained. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia. Maybe the stuff he smoked messed with his head. But then I saw it too. Not the exact same guy, but a pattern. Middle-aged men, clean-cut, hanging around places that didn't make sense. In car parks, outside supermarkets. One of them stood across the street from my place for almost an hour. Didn't move, just leaned on a street pole like he belonged there. Then Sam disappeared. He didn't show up to work. His phone went straight to voicemail. I went to his flat, but no one answered. I called his parents. They hadn't heard from him either. 2 days later, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was an address. I didn't go. I couldn't. But someone did, because the police found him later that week, barefoot, covered in bruises, barely speaking. He wouldn't tell anyone where he'd been. It took a few days, but eventually he opened up. Said he'd been grabbed off the street, blindfolded, driven somewhere. He heard accents, Middle Eastern maybe. He said they didn't hurt him at first, just asked questions about what he knew, who gave him access, whether he believed in sacrifice for a greater cause. They wanted him to join something, help spread something. He didn't get the full picture, but it was bad, like terror cell bad. They let him go eventually, or maybe he escaped. That part never came out clearly. He said he ran through the woods until he hit a road, flagged down a trucker who didn't speak English. After that, he wasn't the same. He moved back in with his parents, stopped going online, barely spoke to anyone. I went to see him once, just once. He looked thinner, eyes sunken. He didn't smile, just kept his blinds shut, and the door chain latched. He said he didn't feel safe, that he thought they were still watching him. 3 weeks later, he was gone. He left a note. I never read it. His parents did, but they wouldn't show anyone. They said it was better that way. That was 6 months ago. And now, standing in my hallway, holding this envelope in my hand, the same pattern tape, the same weight, the same faint chemical smell. I can't pretend it's over, because it just started again.